The Mary's Room Thought Experiment. Locked away from birth, a brilliant scientist knows everything about color except what it's like to actually see it. Philosopher Frank Jackson imagined Mary, a scientist who specializes in the physics and psychology of color, but has been raised in a black and white room, seeing the world only through black and white monitors. She knows every physical fact about color, which wavelengths correspond to red, how the eye processes different frequencies, what brain states occur when people see blue. Mary knows that strawberries cause people to experience red, that people prefer certain color combinations, that the color red can evoke feelings of passion or anger. She can predict perfectly how people will respond to different colors. Her knowledge of the physical facts about color is complete and exhaustive. Then one day, Mary leaves her room and sees a red apple for the first time. Jackson argued that Mary learns something new in that moment, something that no amount of physical knowledge could have taught her. She learns what it's like to experience redness. This suggests that there are facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that cannot be captured by physical science. The thought experiment challenges physicalism, the view that everything is ultimately physical. If Mary learns something new upon seeing red, then her previous complete physical knowledge was missing something. This something appears to be the subjective, experiential aspect of mental states, what philosophers call qualia. Critics argue that Mary doesn't really learn new facts, but rather acquires new abilities, like being able to recognize colors or imagine them. Others claim that Mary's situation is impossible. Complete physical knowledge would include the ability to trigger color experiences in her brain. The debate cuts to the heart of the mind-body problem. Are mental states nothing more than brain states? Or is there something about consciousness that escapes physical description? Mary's Room suggests that even perfect scientific knowledge might miss the most important aspect of experience, what it's actually like to have that experience. The implications extend beyond philosophy to questions about artificial intelligence, the nature of knowledge, and whether science can ever fully explain human consciousness. Mary's moment of seeing color for the first time might represent the permanent gap between objective knowledge and subjective understanding.
The trolley problem. A runaway trolley barrels toward 5 people tied to the tracks, and you stand next to a lever that could save them. Moral philosopher Philippa Foot created this scenario in 1967 to expose the hidden machinery of our ethical intuitions. You can pull the lever to divert the trolley to a sidetrack where it will kill 1 person instead of 5. The mathematics seems simple: 1 death versus 5 deaths. Most people say they would pull the lever. But then the scenario shifts. This time, you're standing on a bridge above the tracks with a large stranger beside you. The trolley approaches the same 5 people. You could push the stranger off the bridge. His body would stop the trolley, killing him but saving the 5. The arithmetic is identical, 1 life for 5, yet most people recoil at pushing the stranger. Why does pulling a lever feel acceptable while pushing someone feel wrong? Both actions deliberately cause 1 person's death to save 5 others. The difference reveals something profound about human morality. We distinguish between killing and letting die, between direct harm and indirect consequences, between using someone as a means and accepting them as collateral damage. The trolley problem spawns endless variations, each one probing different aspects of moral reasoning. What if the 1 person is your child? What if the 5 are criminals? What if you're not sure the lever will work? Each twist reveals new layers of complexity in what seemed like a simple ethical calculation. Modern technology makes these dilemmas urgently real. Autonomous vehicles must be programmed with algorithms that decide who lives and dies in unavoidable accidents. Medical professionals distribute limited resources, knowing their choices will determine who survives. Military drones operate according to rules of engagement that calculate acceptable losses. The trolley problem doesn't offer answers. Instead, it reveals the beautiful and terrifying complexity of moral reasoning, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our deepest ethical intuitions might be inconsistent, culturally conditioned, and ultimately mysterious even to ourselves.
Plato's cave allegory. Deep underground, prisoners mistake shadows for reality, unaware that truth lies in the blinding light above. Imagine you've lived your entire life chained in a dark cave, facing a stone wall. Behind you burns a fire, and between you and the flames, people walk by carrying objects. You've never seen these people or objects directly. All you know are the shadows they cast on the wall before you. These moving shapes become your entire universe. You name them, categorize them, develop theories about their behavior. To you, these shadows are reality itself. Now imagine one day your chains break. You turn around and see the fire, the people, the objects casting shadows. The revelation is blinding, literally and metaphorically. What you thought was reality was merely a projection, a dim reflection of something far more complex and beautiful. But the story doesn't end there. You stumble toward the cave entrance and emerge into sunlight. The brightness is overwhelming, but gradually your eyes adjust. You see trees, not tree shadows, birds, not bird silhouettes, the sun itself, the source of all illumination, not flickering firelight. When you return to tell the other prisoners about the world beyond, they think you've lost your mind. Your descriptions sound like fantasy. They prefer their familiar shadows to your disturbing revelations about reality. They might even become angry, violently defending their shadow world against your uncomfortable truths. Plato crafted this allegory 2,400 years ago to illustrate humanity's relationship with knowledge and truth. We are all prisoners in caves of limited perception, mistaking our narrow experiences for ultimate reality. True wisdom requires the courage to turn away from comfortable illusions and face the sometimes painful light of truth. The allegory resonates powerfully today. We live in information bubbles, social media echo chambers, and cultural caves that shape what we accept as real. Each breakthrough in science reveals how much our senses deceive us.
Nihilism. If nothing ultimately matters, then the fact that nothing matters doesn't matter either, potentially undermining nihilism itself. Nihilism claims that existence is fundamentally meaningless, that no values are objectively valid, and that nothing we do has ultimate significance. But if this claim is true, then nihilism itself lacks meaning and significance. Why should we care whether nihilism is true if caring itself is meaningless? The paradox becomes more complex when we consider how nihilists typically present their position. They often seem to think it matters that we recognize meaninglessness, that we should abandon illusions about purpose and value, that facing truth is better than living in delusion. But these attitudes presuppose that truth, honesty, and accurate perception are valuable, exactly the kinds of values that nihilism denies. The paradox shows that nihilism might be pragmatically self-defeating even if it's theoretically correct. To argue for nihilism, defend it against criticism, or live according to its implications requires caring about things like truth, consistency, and rational discourse. But caring about anything seems inconsistent with genuine nihilism.
Some nihilists try to avoid the paradox by embracing complete indifference. They argue that recognizing meaninglessness should lead to a state where nothing matters, including the recognition itself. But this response faces the problem that genuine indifference would prevent someone from articulating or defending nihilism. The very act of philosophical nihilism demonstrates that the nihilist still cares about something. Others argue that nihilism doesn't require emotional indifference, only intellectual recognition that no values are ultimately grounded. You can continue caring about things while acknowledging that your caring lacks cosmic significance. But this seems to weaken nihilism into a much less radical position, merely claiming that values aren't written into the fabric of reality, rather than denying their existence entirely. The paradox might point toward a different understanding of meaning and value. Perhaps meaning doesn't require ultimate objective foundations, but can emerge from human commitment and concern even in a fundamentally meaningless universe. Albert Camus suggested that we can create meaning through the very act of acknowledging meaninglessness and continuing to live fully despite it. Alternatively, the paradox might show that complete nihilism is impossible for creatures like us. Human consciousness might be inherently evaluative, always finding some things more significant than others, even when we intellectually deny the reality of significance. We might be psychologically incapable of genuine nihilism, making it more of a philosophical thought experiment than a livable worldview. The paradox of nihilism reveals the complex relationship between theoretical beliefs and practical engagement with life. Even the most radical skepticism about meaning seems to presuppose that it matters whether we're skeptical about meaning. This might suggest that some form of caring or valuing is inescapable for conscious beings, making complete nihilism not false, but unthinkable.
The Chinese room argument. In a locked room sits a person who speaks no Chinese, yet appears to understand the language perfectly through an elaborate trick. Philosopher John Searle imagined this scenario in 1980 to challenge the idea that computers could truly think. The person in the room has a comprehensive rule book written in English. When Chinese characters are slipped under the door, they follow the rules to manipulate symbols and slip back appropriate Chinese responses. To outside observers, the room appears to understand Chinese perfectly, conducting sophisticated conversations and answering complex questions. But the person inside understands nothing. They're simply following mechanical rules, matching symbols to symbols without grasping meaning. They could respond correctly to a question about love or mathematics while having no idea what love or mathematics actually are. Searle argued that this is exactly what computers do. No matter how sophisticated their programming, they're just manipulating symbols according to rules. They can pass every test of intelligence while understanding nothing at all. The room might perfectly simulate understanding, but simulation isn't the same as the real thing. The argument strikes at the heart of artificial intelligence. If a computer can answer any question, write poetry, solve problems, and hold conversations indistinguishable from human interaction, what more could we ask for? Yet Searle insists something crucial would still be missing: genuine understanding, real meaning, actual thought. Critics point out that while the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, perhaps the entire system does. The room as a whole, including the person, the rulebook, and the process, might possess understanding that no individual component has. This suggests consciousness and understanding might emerge from complex interactions rather than residing in any single place. The debate has become more urgent as AI systems grow increasingly sophisticated.
When a computer writes a poem about heartbreak, is it expressing genuine emotion or merely manipulating symbols? When it solves a mathematical theorem, does it understand mathematics or just follow algorithms? The Chinese room forces us to question whether intelligence and consciousness are the same thing and whether we could ever tell the difference.
Tabula Rasa. The human mind begins as a blank slate, empty of innate ideas and knowledge. Everything we know comes from experience through our senses. This empiricist doctrine, famously defended by John Locke, claims that there are no inborn concepts, principles, or abilities, only the capacity to receive and process information from the external world. The blank slate theory challenges rationalist claims that some knowledge is innate, or that the mind comes equipped with built-in concepts and reasoning abilities. Instead, it suggests that all mental content derives from sensation and reflection on sensory experiences. Complex ideas build up through combinations and associations of simple sensory impressions. This view has profound implications for human nature, education, and social policy. If minds truly start blank, then differences in knowledge, ability, and character result entirely from different experiences and learning opportunities. This makes education enormously important, while suggesting that people are fundamentally equal in their initial cognitive potential. The theory also supports optimistic views about human perfectibility and social progress. If behavior and beliefs come from experience rather than fixed nature, then improved environments and educational methods could theoretically eliminate ignorance, prejudice, and antisocial behavior. Bad behavior would reflect bad experiences rather than inherent flaws. However, modern psychology and neuroscience challenge strong versions of the blank slate theory. Research reveals that infants are born with remarkable abilities and predispositions. Newborns can distinguish faces from other patterns, show preferences for human speech sounds, and demonstrate basic numerical abilities. These findings suggest significant innate cognitive structure.
Language acquisition provides particularly striking evidence against blank slate theories. Children learn their native languages with remarkable speed and uniformity, despite limited and often imperfect input. They regularly produce sentences they've never heard and follow grammatical rules they've never been explicitly taught. This suggests that the capacity for language includes substantial innate components. Cultural universals also challenge pure empiricism. Despite dramatically different environments and experiences, human societies show similar patterns in areas like kinship systems, moral emotions, and social organization. These universals might reflect shared human nature rather than purely learned responses to environmental challenges. Evolutionary psychology offers explanations for why the mind would not be entirely blank. Natural selection should have equipped humans with specialized cognitive abilities adapted to ancestral environments. These might include capacities for social cooperation, threat detection, mate selection, and resource acquisition that don't require extensive learning. Yet the blank slate metaphor retains important insights about human development and social justice. Even if minds aren't entirely empty at birth, experience clearly plays a huge role in shaping knowledge, values, and behavior. Environmental factors like education, culture, and social relationships remain crucial for human development. The debate also raises questions about moral and political responsibility. If people's beliefs and actions result largely from factors beyond their control, whether innate predispositions or environmental influences, What implications does this have for praise, blame, and punishment? Modern views typically embrace interaction between innate predispositions and environmental influences rather than pure blank slate or pure nativism. The mind might come equipped with learning mechanisms and broad tendencies that require specific experiences to develop into mature cognitive and moral capacities.
The golden mean. Virtue lies in finding the right balance between extremes. This ancient Greek principle, developed by Aristotle, suggests that most ethical behavior involves moderation rather than absolute positions. Courage, for instance, represents the mean between cowardice, too little courage, and recklessness, too much courage. The golden mean doesn't simply advocate moderation in all things. Rather, it recognizes that different situations call for different responses, and virtue involves finding the appropriate level of response for each context. The mean between extremes varies depending on circumstances, individuals, and specific moral challenges. Consider the virtue of generosity. The deficient extreme is stinginess or selfishness, giving too little to others in need. The excessive extreme is profligacy or foolish spending, giving so much that you harm yourself or your dependents. Generous behavior finds the right balance, giving appropriately based on your resources, others' needs, and the specific situation. This approach to ethics emphasizes practical wisdom and situational judgment rather than rigid rules or principles. What counts as virtuous behavior depends on careful assessment of particular circumstances rather than mechanical application of universal commands. The golden mean requires developing good judgment through experience and reflection. The doctrine applies to emotions as well as actions. Anger, for example, can be appropriate or inappropriate depending on its intensity, duration, and object. Righteous anger at injustice might be virtuous, while excessive anger or complete inability to feel anger might both represent vices. The virtuous person feels emotions in proportion to their objects. However, the golden mean faces several philosophical challenges. Some actions seem intrinsically wrong regardless of circumstances. Torture, betrayal, or promise-breaking might not have virtuous means between opposing extremes. The doctrine might not apply to all areas of morality or might require additional principles to handle absolute prohibitions. Determining the mean also requires standards for judging what counts as appropriate or excessive. Without objective criteria, the golden mean might collapse into relativism, where any behavior can be justified as striking the right balance for particular circumstances. The theory needs some account of how to identify genuine virtue rather than mere compromise. Cultural variation in moral judgments creates additional complications. Different societies might identify different behaviors as representing appropriate means between extremes. If the golden mean depends on social norms and expectations, its moral authority becomes questionable when those norms conflict or change over time. Despite these challenges, the golden mean captures important insights about moral psychology and practical ethics. Many moral failures do seem to involve imbalance or excess rather than simple rule-breaking. Developing virtue often requires learning to moderate natural impulses and find appropriate responses to complex situations. The principle also emphasizes character development over rule following. Instead of memorizing moral principles, people need to cultivate dispositions to act, think, and feel appropriately across diverse situations. This makes moral education a matter of habit formation and practical experience rather than abstract learning. Modern applications of the golden mean appear in discussions of work-life balance, emotional regulation, and conflict resolution. The principle suggests that sustainable and healthy approaches to life typically avoid extreme positions while remaining sensitive to contextual demands and individual differences. The hard problem of consciousness. Behind your eyes, the universe becomes aware of itself through the most puzzling phenomenon in existence. When you open your eyes, photons strike your retina and trigger electrical signals. These signals race through neural pathways, processed by networks of neurons firing in precise patterns. But somewhere in this biological machinery, something impossible happens. The lights come on. You don't just process visual information like a camera would. You experience the vivid redness of a rose, the deep blue of an ocean, the golden warmth of sunlight. David Chalmers named this the hard problem of consciousness, distinguishing it from the easy problems of explaining brain functions. We can map how neurons fire when you see red, but we cannot explain why there's something it's like to see red at all. Why isn't your brain simply a sophisticated biological robot processing everything perfectly, but with nobody home to experience it? The mystery deepens when you consider that consciousness appears to serve no survival function that unconscious processing couldn't handle better. A philosophical zombie, physically identical to you but lacking inner experience, would behave exactly as you do. It would even claim to be conscious, write poetry about its feelings, and insist it experiences the redness of red. Some scientists propose that consciousness emerges from the brain's information integration. Others suggest quantum effects create our inner experience. But these theories still face the explanatory gap. How does any physical process, no matter how complex, give rise to the felt quality of experience? Perhaps consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but is instead a fundamental feature of reality itself, like mass or electric charge. This possibility suggests that every particle in the universe has some primitive form of experience, and your rich consciousness emerges from the orchestrated dance of billions of these micro-minds. The veil of ignorance. Behind a curtain that hides your future identity, you must design the rules for an entire society. Political philosopher John Rawls proposed this thought experiment in 1971 to discover truly fair principles of justice. Imagine you're tasked with creating the laws, institutions, and social structures for a new society. But there's a catch. You don't know what position you'll occupy in this society. You might be born rich or poor, healthy or disabled, brilliant or average, into any race, gender, or religion. This veil of ignorance forces you to consider what kind of society you would want if you had an equal chance of being anyone in it. You can't stack the deck in favor of the wealthy because you might be born poor. You can't discriminate against minorities because you might be one. You can't ignore the needs of the disabled because you might have disabilities. Rawls argued that rational people behind this veil would choose two fundamental principles. First, everyone should have equal basic rights and freedoms. Second, social and economic inequalities should only exist if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. In other words, you might accept that some people earn more than others, but only if those inequalities somehow help the worst off. The thought experiment reveals how self-interest and moral concern can align. When you don't know your position, self-interest requires you to care about everyone's welfare. The veil strips away the biases and privileges that usually distort our thinking about justice, forcing us to consider society from every possible perspective. Critics argue that people behind the veil might choose differently than Rawls suggested. Some might gamble on being among the privileged few in a highly unequal society. Others might prioritize different values like freedom over equality or tradition over innovation. But the power of the veil lies not in the specific conclusions it generates, but in the perspective it provides. It asks us to step outside our particular circumstances and consider what we would want if we could be anyone. This shift in viewpoint has influenced everything, from constitutional design to corporate ethics, challenging us to create institutions that we would accept from any position in society.
The Bootstrap Paradox. A time traveler goes back in history and gives Shakespeare a book of plays written by Shakespeare, which Shakespeare then copies and publishes as his own work. This paradox reveals the logical knots that time travel creates around causation and origin. Where did the plays originally come from? They weren't created by the time traveler, who got them from history books. They weren't created by Shakespeare, who simply copied them from the time traveler. The information appears to exist in a causal loop with no beginning, bootstrapping itself into existence. The paradox extends beyond science fiction into fundamental questions about causation itself. In quantum mechanics, some interpretations suggest that future measurements can influence past events. In cosmology, some models propose that the universe might cause its own existence through quantum fluctuations. Reality might be full of bootstrap paradoxes we simply don't recognize. Consider a more subtle version. You travel back in time and accidentally inspire young Einstein to develop relativity theory by mentioning some key insights. But those insights came from studying Einstein's theory in your own time. Who really discovered relativity? The paradox suggests that causation might be more circular and mysterious than we assume. The bootstrap paradox challenges our linear understanding of cause and effect. We expect every effect to have a prior cause, creating chains that stretch back to some ultimate origin. But if time travel is possible, these chains might loop back on themselves, creating effects that are their own causes. Some philosophers argue that bootstrap paradoxes prove time travel is impossible. If allowing time travel creates logical contradictions, then the laws of physics must prevent it. Others suggest that paradoxes reveal the limitations of our concepts of causation and identity rather than impossibilities in nature. The paradox also raises questions about creativity and originality. If information can loop through time without origin, what does it mean to create something new? Perhaps all human creativity involves discovering things that already exist in some timeless realm of possibilities, making every inventor a time traveler, retrieving future knowledge from the realm of pure potential.
The experience machine. A brilliant neuroscientist offers you the chance to plug into a machine that will give you any experience you desire for the rest of your life. Philosopher Robert Nozick proposed this thought experiment to challenge hedonistic theories of the good life. The experience machine would stimulate your brain to create perfect happiness, lasting love, great achievements, beautiful experiences. You could live the life of your dreams, feeling fulfilled and content every moment until you die. But there's a catch. Once you plug in, you'll never know you're in the machine. Your experiences will feel completely real, but they'll be nothing more than electrical stimulations of your neurons. You won't actually write great novels, love real people, or accomplish meaningful goals. You'll just experience the illusion of doing these things. Most people recoil from the machine, even though it guarantees perfect happiness. This suggests that we value more than just positive experiences. We want our lives to connect with reality, to involve genuine relationships, to accomplish actual goals. We prefer the possibility of real suffering to the certainty of fake happiness. The machine reveals three things we seem to value beyond experiences: actually doing certain things rather than just experiencing them, being certain kinds of people rather than just feeling like we are, and making a genuine difference in the world rather than just believing we do. But the thought experiment raises troubling questions. If you discovered tomorrow that you were already in the machine, would your life suddenly become meaningless? How could you tell the difference between plugged-in happiness and authentic happiness? Perhaps we're all already in experience machines of various kinds: cultural conditioning, psychological biases, biochemical processes that shape our perception of reality. The machine also challenges our confidence in our own values. Maybe we reject it only because we're evolutionarily programmed to prefer reality, not because reality is actually better. Perhaps someone raised entirely in the machine would find our real world as unappealing as we find theirs. The experience machine forces us to clarify what makes life worth living. Is it the quality of our experiences, the authenticity of our connections, the reality of our accomplishments, or something else entirely? The answer shapes how we should live, what goals we should pursue, and whether happiness itself is worth pursuing at all.
The hard problem of altruism. Evolutionary theory suggests that natural selection should favor selfish behavior, yet humans regularly sacrifice their own interests for others, including complete strangers they will never meet again. This creates a puzzle for understanding human nature and moral behavior. If evolution shapes organisms to maximize their reproductive success, why do people donate to charity, volunteer for dangerous military service, or risk their lives to help strangers? Such behaviors seem to reduce rather than enhance the helper's evolutionary fitness. Some explanations focus on kin selection, the idea that helping relatives indirectly promotes your own genetic success because relatives share your genes. But this cannot explain help given to non-relatives, especially in modern contexts where people assist individuals from completely different genetic populations. Reciprocal altruism offers another evolutionary explanation. Helping others creates expectations of future assistance, making altruism a form of long-term self-interest. But this fails to explain one-shot interactions with strangers, anonymous donations, or help given to people who clearly cannot reciprocate. Group selection theories propose that altruistic behaviors evolved because groups containing altruists outcompeted groups of pure selfish actors. But this explanation faces mathematical difficulties, since selfish individuals within altruistic groups should have advantages over their altruistic group mates, eventually eliminating altruistic traits from the population. Cultural evolution provides another possible explanation. Perhaps humans evolved psychological mechanisms that make them susceptible to cultural norms promoting cooperation and altruism. These norms spread not through genetic inheritance, but through learning and imitation, allowing pro-social behaviors to persist even if they're genetically costly. But this raises the question of why humans would be uniquely susceptible to cultural influences that promote behavior contrary to their genetic interests. Other species also learn from each other, but they don't seem to develop cultural norms that systematically override biological imperatives in the way human moral systems do. The problem becomes more acute when we consider extreme forms of altruism. People who dedicate their entire lives to helping others, donate most of their income to effective charities, or sacrifice their lives for strangers. These behaviors seem impossible to explain through any combination of evolutionary mechanisms that ultimately serve genetic self-interest. Some philosophers and scientists argue that genuine altruism reveals something unique about human consciousness and moral agency. Perhaps the capacity for abstract reasoning, moral reflection, and imaginative identification with others allows humans to transcend their evolutionary programming in ways that other species cannot. Others maintain that apparently altruistic behavior always serves hidden selfish purposes: reputation enhancement, psychological satisfaction, social conformity, or unconscious genetic calculation. They argue that truly selfless behavior is psychologically impossible because all actions ultimately flow from the actor's own motivations and desires. The hard problem of altruism forces us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the relationship between biological and cultural evolution. Whether genuine altruism exists has profound implications for ethics, social policy, and our understanding of what makes human behavior distinctively human.
Occam's razor. When faced with competing explanations for the same phenomenon, prefer the simplest one that accounts for all the relevant evidence. This principle of theoretical economy, attributed to William of Occam, suggests that unnecessary complexity should be avoided in scientific theories and philosophical arguments. The razor doesn't claim that reality itself is simple, only that simpler explanations are more likely to be correct when they explain the same data equally well. Complex theories require more assumptions, create more opportunities for error, and are harder to test and refute. Simplicity serves as a guide for theory selection rather than a metaphysical claim about the nature of reality. Scientific applications of Occam's razor abound throughout history. When Copernicus proposed that Earth orbits the Sun rather than vice versa, his heliocentric model was initially no more accurate than Ptolemaic astronomy. However, the Copernican system was much simpler, requiring fewer epicycles and ad hoc adjustments to match observations. This simplicity eventually helped establish its superiority. Similarly, Newton's laws of motion and gravitation provided simpler explanations for planetary motion than previous theories that required different principles for terrestrial and celestial phenomena. Einstein's theories of relativity unified previously separate domains of physics under simpler mathematical frameworks, despite their counterintuitive implications. However, applying Occam's razor requires careful judgment about what counts as simple and what constitutes equivalent explanations. Simplicity can be measured in various ways: fewer entities, fewer assumptions, less mathematical complexity, or greater unification of previously separate phenomena. These different measures sometimes point toward different theories.
The principle also faces philosophical challenges about the relationship between simplicity and truth. Why should we expect reality to conform to human preferences for theoretical elegance? Complex phenomena might require complex explanations, and our cognitive limitations might make genuinely correct theories seem unnecessarily complicated. Some philosophers argue that Occam's razor reflects pragmatic considerations rather than epistemic principles. Simpler theories are easier to understand, test, and apply, making them more useful for practical purposes
regardless of their truth. The razor might guide theory choice based on utility rather than likelihood of correctness. Others suggest that the principle has evolutionary or logical foundations. Natural selection might have equipped humans with cognitive biases towards simplicity because simpler patterns are more likely to represent genuine regularities in the environment. Or the razor might reflect logical principles about probability and evidence that favor theories with fewer independent assumptions. In philosophy, Occam's razor often appears in debates about the existence of abstract objects, mental states, or theoretical entities. If physical processes can explain all observable phenomena, why postulate additional metaphysical categories? The razor suggests preferring theories that minimize ontological commitments while preserving explanatory power. However, the principle must be balanced against other theoretical virtues like explanatory breadth, predictive accuracy, and fertility for future research. Sometimes more complex theories provide significantly better explanations or generate more productive research programs than simpler alternatives. Simplicity is one consideration among many, rather than an absolute rule. Modern applications of Occam's razor appear in machine learning, where simpler models often generalize better to new data than complex ones that overfit training examples. The principle also guides medical diagnosis, legal reasoning, and everyday problem-solving where multiple explanations compete for acceptance.
The Paradox of Hedonism. The harder you chase happiness, the more it slips through your fingers like water. This cruel irony of human psychology suggests that direct pursuit of pleasure often leads to its opposite. The person who desperately seeks happiness often finds themselves miserable, while those who focus on other goals stumble upon joy as an unexpected side effect. Philosopher John Stuart Mill captured this paradox perfectly. Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, even on some art or pursuit, followed not as a means but as itself an ideal end. The paradox appears everywhere in human experience. The parent who tries too hard to make their child love them often pushes the child away. The comedian who desperately needs laughs rarely gets them. The person who constantly asks, "Am I happy?" usually isn't. Happiness seems to require a kind of forgetfulness about happiness itself. Psychologists have documented this phenomenon experimentally. People who prioritize hedonic goals, like wealth, fame, and pleasure, report lower levels of life satisfaction than those who pursue eudaimonic goals, like personal growth, relationships, and meaning. The very act of making happiness your primary objective appears to undermine your ability to achieve it. The paradox suggests something profound about human nature. We might be designed to find fulfillment through transcending ourselves rather than focusing on ourselves. When we lose ourselves in meaningful work, loving relationships, or noble causes, happiness emerges naturally. When we turn inward and monitor our own emotional states, contentment becomes elusive. This creates a practical dilemma for how to live. If happiness comes from not seeking it directly, how do you pursue it at all? The answer might lie in finding worthy goals beyond your own satisfaction, trusting that joy will follow when you're not looking for it. The paradox of hedonism suggests that the secret to a happy life might be forgetting about happiness altogether.
The problem of other minds. You wake up each morning surrounded by beings who might be nothing more than empty shells performing an elaborate charade. Every person you've ever met has convinced you they have inner experiences like yours. They speak of pain when injured, joy when delighted, fear when threatened.
But you've never actually experienced another person's consciousness. You can see their behavior, hear their words, observe their reactions, but the inner theater of their experience remains forever hidden from you. This creates one of philosophy's most isolating puzzles. You know with absolute certainty that you have consciousness, thoughts, and feelings. But how can you ever know if anyone else does? The person sitting next to you might be a sophisticated automaton, programmed to respond exactly as a conscious being would, but with no inner experience whatsoever. The problem becomes more troubling when you realize that even the most convincing evidence of another's consciousness could be fabricated. If someone describes the exact experience you have when seeing red, they might simply be programmed with the right words. Their tears might be mechanical responses, their laughter, empty performance. Philosopher Thomas Nagel highlighted this mystery by asking what it's like to be a bat. Even if we mapped every neuron in a bat's brain, would we understand its experience of echolocation? The subjective reality of another mind might be forever beyond our reach, leaving us alone with our consciousness in a world that might be filled with unconscious actors. Yet somehow, we build our entire lives on the assumption that others are conscious like us. Love, friendship, empathy, and society itself depend on believing that others have rich inner lives. Perhaps the question isn't whether other minds exist, but why we need so desperately to believe they do.
Utilitarianism. Actions are right insofar as they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This consequentialist ethical theory, developed by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, judges moral worth entirely by outcomes rather than intentions, rules, or character traits. Classical utilitarianism holds that pleasure and the absence of pain are the only things intrinsically valuable. All other goods, knowledge, beauty, freedom, justice, matter only insofar as they contribute to overall happiness or well-being. The theory provides a seemingly objective standard for moral evaluation by reducing all values to a single metric. The utilitarian calculus requires comparing and aggregating different people's welfare to determine which actions produce the best overall consequences. This involves difficult judgments about how to measure happiness, compare different types of pleasures and pains, and weigh present against future effects. Yet the theory promises a systematic approach to moral decision-making based on empirical assessment of outcomes. Utilitarianism supports many moral intuitions while challenging others. It condemns slavery, murder, and theft because these practices typically reduce overall well-being. It supports charity, honesty, and cooperation because these behaviors generally increase aggregate happiness. The theory provides strong reasons for reducing suffering and promoting human flourishing. However, utilitarianism faces serious objections that test its plausibility as a complete moral theory. The doctrine of act utilitarianism seems to permit or even require actions that most people consider wrong if those actions maximize overall utility. Punishing innocent people might be justified if it prevents greater suffering through deterrent effects. The theory also struggles with issues of justice and individual rights. If enslaving a small minority would significantly increase the happiness of a large majority, utilitarian logic seems to support slavery. The theory appears to treat people as mere containers of utility, rather than respecting their inherent dignity and rights. Rule utilitarianism attempts to address these concerns by focusing on the consequences of following general rules rather than individual acts. Instead of asking whether lying in a particular case maximizes utility, rule utilitarians ask whether a general rule permitting lying would have good consequences if everyone followed it. However, rule utilitarianism faces its own problems. If the rule utilitarian standard is what would happen if everyone followed particular rules, the theory might collapse into act utilitarianism in cases where rule-breaking would clearly produce better outcomes. If the standard is what would happen if most people followed the rules, the theory needs to specify how many exceptions are permissible. Preference utilitarianism replaces happiness with satisfaction of preferences as the fundamental good. This avoids some problems with measuring and comparing different types of pleasures, while creating new challenges about which preferences count and how to handle adaptive preferences or preferences based on false beliefs. Modern developments in utilitarian theory include negative utilitarianism, which focuses on minimizing suffering rather than maximizing happiness, and various forms of rule consequentialism that evaluate moral codes rather than individual rules. These approaches attempt to preserve utilitarian insights while addressing traditional objections. The theory also faces practical challenges about knowledge and computation. Calculating the full consequences of actions requires predicting complex social and psychological effects that might be unknowable in practice. Utilitarian decision-making might be impossible given human cognitive limitations and uncertainty about outcomes.
The Gettier Problem. A man checks his watch, sees it's 3 o'clock, and forms the justified true belief that it's 3 o'clock. But his watch stopped exactly 12 hours ago. Philosopher Edmund Gettier used cases like this in 1963 to shatter thousands of years of philosophical consensus about the nature of knowledge. Since ancient times, philosophers had agreed that knowledge was justified true belief. You know something when you believe it, it's actually true, and you have good reasons for believing it. Gettier's cases show that these three conditions aren't sufficient. The man has a true belief, it really is 3 o'clock. He has justification, his normally reliable watch, but intuitively he doesn't have knowledge. He just got lucky. His belief is true for the wrong reasons. Consider another case. Smith has strong evidence that Jones owns a Ford. Smith reasonably concludes either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Boston. This disjunction is true because Brown happens to be in Boston, though Jones doesn't actually own a Ford. Smith has justified true belief, but not knowledge. These cases reveal that knowledge requires more than just justified true belief. But what's the missing ingredient? Philosophers have proposed dozens of solutions. Some argue that knowledge requires beliefs to be true in nearby possible worlds. Others demand that the justification be undefeated by any true information. Still others claim that knowledge must be produced by reliable processes or safe methods. Each proposed solution faces its own counterexamples. The search for a perfect definition of knowledge has become increasingly complex, with conditions and subconditions multiplying endlessly. Some philosophers now doubt whether knowledge can be defined at all in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. The Gettier problem illustrates how philosophical progress can sometimes mean discovering that our most basic concepts are more mysterious than we thought. After decades of analysis, we might understand knowledge less clearly than when we started. This suggests that the concepts we use most confidently might be the ones we understand least well. The problem also raises questions about the relationship between philosophical analysis and ordinary usage. People continue to use the word knowledge successfully in everyday life, apparently untroubled by Gettier cases. Perhaps the philosophical quest for precision distorts concepts that work perfectly well in their natural habitat of human communication.
The paradox of fiction. This paradox, identified by philosopher Colin Radford, reveals something puzzling about emotional responses to fiction. Normally, emotions require beliefs. You fear the approaching storm because you believe it might harm you. You grieve for your friend because you believe they have died. But fictional emotions seem to violate this pattern. When you watch a horror movie, you feel genuine fear, even though you know the monster isn't real and cannot harm you. When you read about fictional injustice, you feel authentic moral outrage, even though you know no actual person was wronged. These emotions are real. Your heart races, you shed tears, you feel moved to action, but they're directed toward things you know don't exist. The paradox suggests three things that cannot all be true simultaneously. We have genuine emotions toward fictional characters. Emotions require beliefs about their objects, and we don't believe fictional characters exist. Something has to give, but each option creates new problems. If fictional emotions aren't genuine, then why do they feel so real and have such powerful effects on our lives? Great literature has shaped moral intuitions, political movements, and personal transformations through emotional engagement with imaginary situations. If these emotions are fake, their real-world impact becomes mysterious. If emotions don't require beliefs, then our entire understanding of emotional psychology needs revision. But this seems wrong. You cannot fear what you don't believe might harm you, love what you don't believe exists, or grieve for what you don't believe is lost. If we do believe fictional characters exist in some sense, then we need to explain what kind of existence they have and how we access it. Perhaps fictional characters exist as abstract objects, or in possible worlds, or as incomplete beings with only some properties. But these metaphysical solutions seem to multiply mysteries rather than solving them. Some philosophers argue that fictional emotions are really directed toward real things. Not Anna Karenina herself, but the type of person she represents, or our own memories and experiences that resonate with her story. Others claim that imagination can generate emotions just as effectively as belief, making fictional emotions a special category that doesn't fit standard emotional theory. The paradox of fiction illuminates the complex relationship between imagination and reality, between emotional life and rational belief, between the stories we tell and the lives we live. It suggests that human psychology might be far more complex than philosophical theories typically allow, capable of genuine responses to entities that exist only in the realm of possibility. The paradox of Buridan's ass. A perfectly rational doggy stands exactly midway between two identical piles of hay. The piles are equidistant and equally appealing in every measurable way. Unable to find any reason to prefer one pile over the other, the donkey cannot decide which way to go. According to the logic of the paradox, the donkey will starve to death, paralyzed by perfect rational analysis in the face of equivalent options. This medieval thought experiment explores the relationship between rationality and action. If rational choice requires sufficient reasons for preferring one option over others, what happens when no such reasons exist? The paradox suggests that perfect rationality might sometimes prevent action altogether, leading to worse outcomes than imperfect decision-making would produce. The situation arises whenever we face genuinely equivalent options. Consider choosing between two identical restaurants, two equally qualified job candidates, or two investment opportunities with identical expected returns. If rationality demands that we choose based on relevant differences, then perfect equivalence should make choice impossible. Yet in practice, people regularly make arbitrary choices in such situations without feeling irrational. When faced with equivalent options, we might flip a coin, follow a hunch, or simply pick one at random. The paradox questions whether such arbitrary choices are rational, or whether rationality itself has limitations that make arbitrary choice necessary. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals false assumptions about rational choice. Perhaps rationality doesn't require always choosing based on reasons. When options are truly equivalent, any choice might be equally rational. The ability to make arbitrary choices when faced with equivalent alternatives might be a feature of rationality rather than a bug. Others suggest that genuinely equivalent options rarely exist in practice. Even when options appear identical, careful analysis usually reveals subtle differences that can guide rational choice. The donkey's predicament might be more theoretical than practical, since real-world decisions typically involve enough relevant differences to break ties. The paradox also raises questions about free will and determinism. If our choices are determined by reasons, and if equivalent options provide no determining reasons, then perhaps free will emerges precisely in situations where rationality alone cannot dictate action. Arbitrary choice might be the clearest expression of genuine freedom. From a practical perspective, the paradox highlights the importance of decision-making procedures that can handle uncertainty and equivalence. Effective decision-makers often use tie-breaking rules, time limits, or other mechanisms that allow action even when perfect rational analysis fails to provide clear guidance.
The butterfly effect. In a distant rainforest, a butterfly flaps its wings, and 3 weeks later, a hurricane devastates a coastal city. This poetic image, coined by meteorologist Edward Lorenz, captures one of the most unsettling discoveries in modern science. Tiny changes can have enormous consequences. The technical term is sensitive dependence on initial conditions. But the butterfly effect captures our imagination because it suggests that the smallest actions might reshape the entire future. The mathematics behind chaos theory reveals that in complex systems, minuscule differences in starting conditions can lead to wildly different outcomes. The butterfly's wing flap doesn't cause the hurricane directly, but it triggers a cascade of atmospheric changes that eventually amplify into a massive storm thousands of miles away. This principle extends far beyond weather systems. The stock market, ecosystems, human societies, even individual lives display chaotic dynamics where small perturbations can have massive consequences. The casual conversation that leads to a life-changing job opportunity, the split-second decision that avoids a fatal accident, the random encounter that leads to marriage. Our lives hang on threads so thin we rarely notice them. The butterfly effect challenges our sense of proportionality and control. We expect big causes to have big effects, and small causes to have small effects. But chaos theory reveals that the universe doesn't follow our intuitions about cause and effect. Sometimes the most significant events arise from the most trivial beginnings. This creates a paradox for human action. If small actions can have enormous consequences, then everything we do might matter immensely. But if the results of our actions are fundamentally unpredictable, how can we act responsibly? The butterfly effect suggests that we might be both more powerful and more powerless than we imagine. The philosophical implications are staggering. Free will, moral responsibility, and rational planning all assume some reasonable connection between intentions and outcomes. But if the butterfly effect governs human affairs, then the consequences of our choices might not just be unpredictable, but inherently unpredictable, forever beyond our ability to foresee or control.
The paradox of confirmation. Every observation of a white swan confirms the hypothesis all swans are white. But every observation of a red apple should equally confirm the same hypothesis, revealing the strange logic of scientific evidence. This paradox, discovered by philosopher Carl Hempel, exposes hidden problems in how we think about scientific confirmation. The hypothesis, all swans are white, is logically equivalent to all non-white things are non-swans. If these statements mean the same thing, then evidence supporting one should equally support the other. Observing a red apple supports the claim all non-white things are non-swans because the apple is both non-white and non-swan. But if this statement is equivalent to all swans are white, then the red apple should confirm our beliefs about swan coloration. This seems absurd. How could looking at fruit tell us anything about waterfowl? The paradox reveals deep puzzles about the logic of confirmation and scientific evidence. Intuitively, we think that evidence should be relevant to hypotheses in obvious ways. Observations of swans should tell us about swans. Observations of apples should tell us about apples. But formal logic suggests that evidence can support hypotheses in ways that violate these intuitive relevance constraints. Some philosophers try to solve the paradox by arguing that the red apple does provide tiny confirmation for the swan hypothesis, but this confirmation is so minimal as to be practically worthless. Others claim that relevance and background knowledge play crucial roles in determining what counts as genuine evidence, making the formal logical relationship less important than contextual factors. The paradox becomes more troubling when we consider that it applies to any universal generalization. The claim all ravens are black should be confirmed by observing white shoes, blue skies, or green grass, since all of these are non-black, non-ravens. This makes the confirmation of scientific laws seem wildly promiscuous, with any observation potentially supporting almost any hypothesis. The problem highlights the gap between formal logic and scientific practice. Scientists don't actually treat all logically equivalent evidence as equally valuable. They use background theories, relevance considerations, and practical constraints to determine which observations count as genuine tests of their hypotheses. Some philosophers argue that the paradox shows the inadequacy of purely logical approaches to scientific confirmation. They propose that confirmation must involve probabilistic reasoning, causal connections, or pragmatic considerations that go beyond simple logical relationships. The paradox might reveal that scientific reasoning is more complex and context-dependent than formal logic suggests. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of scientific objectivity. If logical relationships don't fully determine what counts as evidence, then scientific confirmation might depend on subjective judgments about relevance, importance, and theoretical context. This doesn't necessarily make science arbitrary, but it suggests that scientific reasoning involves forms of judgment that cannot be completely formalized. Perhaps most fundamentally, the paradox challenges our understanding of what it means for evidence to support a hypothesis. The relationship between observation and theory might be more mysterious and context-dependent than we typically assume, requiring forms of reasoning that blend logical, probabilistic, causal, and pragmatic considerations in ways that resist simple characterization.
Falsificationism. A theory is scientific only if it can potentially be proven wrong by empirical observation. Karl Popper's philosophy of science argues that the ability to be falsified rather than verified distinguishes genuine science from pseudoscience. Scientific theories must make risky predictions that could expose them to refutation by evidence. The principle emerged from Popper's observation that some apparently scientific theories seemed immune to refutation. Psychoanalysis, Marxist historical theory, and astrology could accommodate any possible evidence by adding auxiliary hypotheses or reinterpreting data. This flexibility made them unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific, according to Popper's criterion. In contrast, genuine scientific theories, like Einstein's relativity, make precise predictions that could be decisively refuted by observation. The theory predicted specific effects, like the bending of light around massive objects during solar eclipses. If these predictions had failed, the theory would have been falsified. The willingness to face such tests makes relativity genuinely scientific. Falsificationism solves the problem of induction by abandoning the attempt to prove theories true from evidence. Instead of seeking confirmation, scientists should try to falsify their theories through severe tests. Theories that survive multiple serious attempts at refutation are more worthy of acceptance than those that haven't been rigorously tested. The approach also explains scientific progress as a process of conjecture and refutation. Scientists propose bold hypotheses, subject them to critical testing, and abandon those that fail. This evolutionary process leads to better theories over time without requiring absolute proof or certain knowledge. However, falsificationism faces several philosophical and practical challenges. The Duhem-Quine thesis argues that individual theories cannot be tested in isolation because they rely on auxiliary assumptions about instruments, background conditions, and other theoretical commitments. When predictions fail, we might reject auxiliary assumptions rather than the main theory.
Historical studies of science reveal that important theories often survive despite apparent falsifications. Newton's theory faced anomalies like the precession of Mercury's orbit for decades before being replaced by relativity. If scientists had immediately abandoned Newton's theory when faced with falsifying evidence, they would have prematurely rejected a highly successful research program. Some scientific theories also seem inherently difficult to falsify. Evolutionary theory, for instance, is supported by vast amounts of evidence but doesn't make the kind of precise, risky predictions that could be easily refuted. Its strength lies in explaining diverse phenomena rather than making specific testable forecasts. Popper later modified his position to acknowledge these problems. Sophisticated falsificationism allows theories to be rescued from falsification through auxiliary modifications as long as these changes lead to novel predictions. The key is that research programs should be progressive rather than degenerative, generating new empirical content rather than merely accommodating anomalies. The demarcation problem, distinguishing science from non-science, proves more complex than early falsificationism suggested. Many activities that seem scientific don't fit the falsificationist model, while some non-scientific activities do make falsifiable claims. The boundaries of science might be gradual and contextual rather than sharp and universal. Despite these challenges, falsificationism has influenced scientific methodology and education. The emphasis on critical testing, precise predictions, and openness to refutation captures important aspects of scientific practice. Even if falsifiability isn't a perfect criterion for science, it highlights virtues like testability and intellectual humility that characterize good scientific work.
The Ship of Theseus paradox. Ancient Greeks discovered a puzzle that would make you question the very foundation of your identity. In the time it took you to process those words, millions of atoms in your body were replaced. Old cells died, and new ones were born. The physical substance of your brain shifted and rewired itself. Yet you feel like the same continuous being, carrying an unbroken thread of identity through this constant transformation. The ancient Greeks understood this puzzle through the story of Theseus's ship. After the hero returned from slaying the Minotaur, the Athenians preserved his vessel as a monument. As the wood decayed over the years, they replaced each rotted plank with fresh timber. Eventually, every single original piece was gone. The question that haunted philosophers: was this still the same ship? The puzzle deepens with a twist. Imagine someone gathered all the discarded original planks and rebuilt them into a ship. Now there are two vessels, both with equal claim to being Theseus's ship. Which one carries the true identity? This isn't merely an abstract riddle. It strikes at the core of what makes you you. Your body completely replaces most of its cells every 7 years. Your memories fade and are unconsciously reconstructed each time you recall them. Your personality evolves. Your beliefs change. Your very DNA accumulates mutations. What connects the child you were to the adult you are now? The paradox becomes even more personal in our digital age. If scientists could perfectly scan your brain and upload your consciousness to a computer, would the digital copy be you continuing to exist? Or would it be an imposter wearing your memories while the real you dies with your biological brain? Perhaps identity is just a story we tell ourselves, a useful fiction that helps us navigate a world of constant change. Or perhaps there's something deeper, an essential core that persists through all transformations. The answer shapes not just philosophy, but how we think about death, responsibility, and what it means to be human. The Monty Problem. 3 doors stand before you. Behind one door sits a valuable prize, while the other two hide worthless goats. You choose door number 1. The host, who knows what lies behind each door, opens door number 3 to reveal a goat. Now the host offers you a choice. Stick with your original selection or switch to door number 2. What should you do? Most people's intuition says it doesn't matter. With 2 doors remaining, each has a 50-50 chance of hiding the prize. This intuition is wrong. Switching doors doubles your chances of winning, from 1/3 to 2/3. This counterintuitive result has sparked decades of debate and reveals how poorly our minds handle certain types of probability. When you initially chose door number 1, it had a 1/3 chance of hiding the prize. This probability doesn't change when the host opens door number 3. The remaining 2 doors collectively had a 2/3 chance of hiding the prize. When the host eliminates one of those doors by showing you a goat, all of that 2/3 probability transfers to the remaining unopened door. The key insight is that the host's action is not random. The host deliberately opens a door with a goat. This intentional act changes the probability landscape in a way that pure chance would not. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice create an asymmetry between your original door and the remaining alternative. Thousands of people, including many mathematicians, initially rejected this solution when it was presented in a popular magazine column. The problem demonstrates how difficult it can be to reason correctly about probability and conditional events, even for trained professionals. The Monty problem has broader implications for decision-making under uncertainty. It shows that additional information, even when it seems irrelevant, can dramatically alter the optimal choice. In real-world situations, we constantly make decisions based on partial information, and our intuitions about probability can lead us astray. The problem also illustrates the importance of understanding the rules and constraints of any situation involving chance. The solution depends critically on the assumption that the host knows where the prize is and will always open a door with a goat. Change these rules, and the optimal strategy changes as well.
Metaethics. What do moral statements mean, and how can they be true or false? Metaethics examines the nature of moral language, concepts, and knowledge rather than specific moral questions. Instead of asking whether abortion is wrong, metaethics asks what it means to say that something is morally wrong and whether such claims can have objective truth values. This second-order inquiry reveals deep puzzles about the relationship between moral judgments and facts about the world. When someone says torture is wrong, are they describing objective moral properties, expressing their emotional attitudes, prescribing behavior, or doing something else entirely? The answer affects how we understand moral disagreement, moral knowledge, and the possibility of moral progress. Moral realism holds that moral statements describe objective facts that exist independently of human beliefs and attitudes. Just as snow is white is true because snow actually is white, torture is wrong is true because torture actually has the objective property of wrongness. This view treats moral properties as features of reality that we can discover through reason or experience.
However, moral properties seem unlike ordinary empirical properties. We can see that snow is white, but we cannot literally perceive moral wrongness. If moral facts exist, they appear to be abstract entities that don't interact causally with our sensory organs. This raises questions about how we could ever know moral truths, or why we should expect our moral beliefs to track moral reality. Non-cognitivist theories deny that moral statements express beliefs that can be true or false. Instead, they function like expressions of emotion, commands, or commitments. When you say, "Torture is wrong," you might be expressing disapproval, commanding others not to torture, or committing yourself to opposing torture. These speech acts have practical effects, but don't describe objective reality.
Emotivism, developed by philosophers like A.J. Ayer and Charles Stevenson, treats moral statements as sophisticated expressions of attitude. Torture is wrong means something like torture, boo, combined with attempts to influence others' attitudes. This explains why moral language has motivational force and why moral disagreements seem so persistent and emotionally charged. Prescriptivism, associated with R.M. Hare, emphasizes the action-guiding function of moral language. Moral statements are universal prescriptions that commit speakers to acting in certain ways under specified circumstances. This approach explains the logical properties of moral reasoning while acknowledging the practical role of moral judgments. Error theory, defended by philosophers like J.L. Mackie, combines realist semantics with anti-realist metaphysics. Moral statements do express beliefs about objective moral facts, but all such beliefs are false because no objective moral facts exist. This position treats moral discourse as systematically mistaken, like ancient beliefs about witches or demons. Constructivist approaches seek middle ground between realism and anti-realism by grounding moral facts in human practices, agreements, or rational procedures. Moral truths might be objective within particular social or cultural contexts without being universal features of reality. This allows for genuine moral knowledge while acknowledging the cultural variability of moral systems. The debate has practical implications for moral education, cross-cultural dialogue, and social policy. If moral realism is true, moral education should focus on discovering objective moral truths. If non-cognitivism is correct, moral education might emphasize attitude formation and commitment rather than factual knowledge. Meta-ethical theories also affect how we understand moral motivation and the relationship between moral judgments and action. Some theories explain why moral beliefs tend to motivate behavior, while others face challenges about bridging the gap between moral knowledge and practical commitment.
The Fermi Paradox. The universe contains billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, many of which likely have planets capable of supporting life. Given the immense number of opportunities for life to develop and the billions of years available for evolution, intelligent civilizations should be common throughout the cosmos. Yet we observe no signs of extraterrestrial intelligence anywhere. This contradiction between expectation and observation is the Fermi Paradox. Named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who supposedly asked, "Where is everybody?" during a casual lunch conversation, the paradox highlights a troubling silence in the cosmos. Our galaxy alone contains hundreds of billions of stars. Even if intelligent life develops on only a tiny fraction of suitable planets, there should be millions of technological civilizations in our galaxy alone. Some of these civilizations would likely be millions or billions of years more advanced than us. Given the exponential pace of technological development we observe on Earth, such civilizations should possess capabilities that seem almost godlike from our perspective. They should be able to travel between stars, harness the energy of entire suns, and leave unmistakable signatures of their presence across the galaxy. Yet when we look to the skies, we see no evidence of vast engineering projects, no signs of interstellar communication networks, no indication that intelligence has ever emerged anywhere else in the observable universe. The silence is deafening and deeply puzzling. Proposed solutions to the paradox range from hopeful to terrifying. Perhaps intelligent life is exceedingly rare, arising only under very specific conditions that exist on very few planets. Perhaps technological civilizations tend to destroy themselves shortly after developing the capability for space travel and interstellar communication. Another possibility is that advanced civilizations deliberately hide their presence from younger species, like ourselves. They might follow something like a cosmic prime directive, avoiding contact until we reach a certain level of development. Or perhaps they exist in forms so advanced that we cannot recognize them, much as bacteria in a pond cannot comprehend human civilization. The paradox forces us to confront fundamental questions about our place in the universe and the future of our own species.
The allegory of the ring of Gyges. A shepherd named Gyges discovers a golden ring that makes its wearer invisible. With this power, he enters the royal palace unseen, seduces the queen, murders the king, and takes over the kingdom. Plato presents this story to explore a fundamental question about human nature. Would anyone be moral if they could act without consequences? The ring of Gyges forces us to examine whether we behave ethically because we genuinely believe it's right, or merely because we fear punishment and social disapproval. If you could act with complete impunity, knowing that no one would ever discover your actions, would you still choose to be good? Most people initially claim they would remain moral, even with the ring's power. Yet honest reflection reveals how much of our behavior is shaped by the possibility of being caught. We don't steal, partly because we might go to jail. We don't lie, partly because we might be found out. We help others, partly because we want to be seen as good people. The thought experiment probes deeper than simple fear of consequences. It examines whether morality has an inherent value or exists solely as a social contract. If being moral provides no personal advantage and creates no social benefits when done in secret, what rational reason exists for moral behavior? Some philosophers argue that virtue is its own reward, that acting morally makes us better people regardless of external outcomes. Others contend that morality only makes sense in a social context, and that isolated moral acts have no meaning. The ring of Gyges crystallizes this debate by removing all social elements from moral choice. The modern world provides subtler versions of Gyges' ring. Internet anonymity allows people to act without social consequences, often revealing behavior they would never exhibit in person. Corporate executives can sometimes make decisions that harm others while protecting themselves from personal repercussions. Politicians may vote privately in ways that contradict their public positions. The allegory also raises questions about power and corruption. Does power corrupt people, or does it simply reveal their true nature? If moral behavior requires constant effort and vigilance, then perhaps most people would indeed succumb to the temptation of consequence-free action.
Yet some individuals throughout history have chosen moral action even when they could have acted otherwise without detection. These examples suggest that ethical behavior might have sources deeper than social pressure or fear of punishment.
The Gaia Hypothesis. Earth functions as a single, self-regulating organism that maintains conditions suitable for life. This provocative idea, proposed by scientist James Lovelock, suggests that biological processes interact with physical and chemical systems to create planetary-scale homeostasis. The biosphere doesn't merely adapt to environmental conditions, but actively regulates them. The hypothesis draws attention to remarkable features of Earth's environment that seem fine-tuned for life. Atmospheric oxygen levels, global temperature, ocean salinity, and soil acidity all remain within ranges that support complex ecosystems, despite dramatic changes in solar output and biological evolution over geological time. These stable conditions might result from active regulation rather than fortunate coincidence. Lovelock named the hypothesis after Gaia, the Greek goddess of Earth, emphasizing the idea of planetary life rather than mere mechanical processes. This metaphorical language sparked controversy among scientists who worried that the hypothesis attributed intentionality or consciousness to natural systems. Critics argued that the Gaia hypothesis was poetic rather than scientific. However, the core insight about planetary regulation has influenced fields from climatology to astrobiology. Earth system science now studies interactions between biological, geological, atmospheric, and oceanic processes as integrated networks rather than separate domains. This holistic approach has revealed numerous feedback mechanisms that stabilize Earth's environment. The regulation of atmospheric oxygen provides a striking example. Oxygen levels affect fire frequency, which influences plant evolution, which affects oxygen production through photosynthesis. If oxygen levels get too high, widespread fires would reduce plant biomass and oxygen production. If levels get too low, many organisms would suffocate. The system appears to maintain oxygen within a narrow range that supports diverse life forms.
Similarly, global temperature regulation involves complex interactions between biological and physical processes. Ocean currents distribute heat around the planet, while cloud formation affects solar radiation reaching Earth's surface. Marine organisms produce chemicals that seed cloud formation, creating potential feedback loops between biological activity and climate regulation. The strong version of the Gaia hypothesis suggests that Earth actively optimizes conditions for life, implying some form of planetary purpose or teleology. This interpretation faces obvious scientific objections. Natural selection operates on individual organisms, not planetary systems. There's no clear mechanism through which Earth could develop goal-directed behavior aimed at supporting life. Weaker versions focus on system-level properties that emerge from biological and physical interactions without requiring planetary consciousness or optimization. Earth's regulatory capacity might result from natural selection operating on organisms that affect their environment in ways that improve their own survival prospects. The hypothesis raises philosophical questions about the nature of life, agency, and purpose in natural systems. Does regulation require conscious intention, Or can complex systems exhibit self-maintaining properties without any form of awareness? The boundary between living and non-living systems might be less clear than traditionally assumed. Environmental applications of Gaian thinking emphasize humanity's role in planetary systems. If Earth functions as an integrated system, human activities that disrupt regulatory mechanisms could have far-reaching consequences. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution might threaten the planetary processes that maintain conditions suitable for human civilization. The hypothesis also connects to questions about the search for life on other planets. If life tends to create detectable changes in planetary atmospheres and surface conditions, these signatures might guide the search for extraterrestrial life. Planets with life might be recognizable through systematic deviations from non-biological chemical equilibrium.
The problem of infinite regress. Every explanation seems to require another explanation, creating an endless chain that threatens to undermine all knowledge. If you ask why something is true, and then ask why that explanation is true, and continue this process indefinitely, you never reach a final, ultimate explanation. This infinite regress appears to show that nothing can be truly explained or justified. The problem appears in multiple areas of philosophy. In epistemology, if every belief requires justification from other beliefs, then either some beliefs are unjustified, making knowledge impossible, or justification forms circular chains, making knowledge unreliable, or the chain continues forever, preventing complete justification. Each alternative seems to threaten the possibility of genuine knowledge. In metaphysics, the regress appears when asking about causation. Every event has a cause. But what causes the cause? If the chain of causation extends infinitely into the past, there seems to be no ultimate explanation for why anything happens. If the chain has a beginning, what explains that first cause? Similar problems arise in ethics and meaning. Moral principles seem to require justification, but those justifications invoke other principles that themselves need justification. The meaning of words depends on other words, which depend on still other words, seemingly forever. These regresses threaten to show that morality is arbitrary and communication is impossible. Various philosophical traditions propose different solutions. Foundationalism argues that some beliefs are self-justifying or justified by direct experience, providing secure starting points that halt the regress. These basic beliefs serve as foundations for all other knowledge, much like axioms in mathematics provide starting points for proofs. Coherentism rejects the foundationalist picture, arguing that beliefs are justified by their fit within a coherent system of mutually supporting beliefs. Instead of linear chains of justification, coherentism envisions webs of interconnected beliefs that support each other without requiring ultimate foundations. Some philosophers embrace infinite regress, arguing that it's not necessarily problematic. Perhaps explanation and justification don't require final stopping points. As long as each step in the chain is valid,
The overall structure might be acceptable, even if it continues indefinitely. Others argue that the regress problem reflects mistaken assumptions about explanation and justification. Perhaps these processes don't work through linear chains at all, but through more complex patterns that avoid regress entirely.
The brain in a vat hypothesis. You might be a disembodied brain floating in a vat of nutrients, connected to a computer that stimulates your neurons to create the illusion of normal sensory experience. Everything you think you know about the external world, your body, other people, physical objects, could be elaborate hallucinations generated by the computer's program. This modern version of ancient skeptical arguments challenges our most basic assumptions about knowledge and reality. If such deception were possible, how could you ever know whether your experiences correspond to an actual external world or are merely convincing simulations? The scenario seems perfectly conceivable from a technological standpoint. If consciousness depends on brain activity, and if we could perfectly simulate all the inputs a brain normally receives from the body and environment, the resulting experiences should be indistinguishable from normal perception. The brain in the vat would have no way to detect its true situation. Some philosophers argue that the hypothesis is self-refuting. If you were a brain in a vat, your words and thoughts about being a brain and a vat couldn't refer to actual brains and vats, since you would have no causal contact with such things. Your statement, "I am a brain in a vat," would necessarily be false, since it couldn't have the meaning you think it has. This semantic argument suggests that certain skeptical scenarios defeat themselves through problems of reference and meaning. However, critics point out that the computer could be programmed to include accurate information about brains and vats in its simulation, allowing meaningful reference to these concepts. The brain in a vat hypothesis raises profound questions about the nature of evidence and justification. If your evidence about the external world comes entirely through your sensory experiences, and if these experiences could be artificially generated, then you seem to have no reliable evidence about reality's true nature. Yet most people live their lives as if the external world exists roughly as they perceive it. This suggests either that we're unjustified in our basic beliefs about reality, or that some forms of knowledge don't require the kind of proof that skeptical arguments demand. The hypothesis also connects to questions about personal identity and the nature of the self. If you are essentially your mind or consciousness, then being a brain in a vat wouldn't change who you are, only your relationship to the external world. The paradox of moral progress. If moral truths are objective and unchanging, how can we explain apparent moral progress throughout history? Yet if morals are subjective and relative, how can we claim that some changes represent genuine improvement? This paradox strikes at fundamental questions about the nature of moral truth and moral change. Throughout history, societies have abandoned practices like slavery, expanded rights to previously excluded groups, and developed more sophisticated understandings of justice and human dignity. These changes seem like genuine moral progress, movements toward better, more enlightened moral positions. But moral progress seems to require that earlier moral beliefs were actually wrong, not just different. If slavery was always morally wrong, then societies that practiced it were making moral errors that later generations corrected.
This suggests that moral truths exist independently of what people happen to believe about morality at any given time. However, if moral truths are objective and timelessly valid, it becomes mysterious why they would be so difficult to discover and why different cultures would reach such different moral conclusions. Why would it take thousands of years for humans to recognize the wrongness of practices that seem obviously immoral to contemporary sensibilities? The alternative view, that moral beliefs are culturally relative with no objective foundation, makes moral progress impossible to explain. If the moral beliefs of slave-owning societies were just as valid within their cultural context as our beliefs are within ours, then the abolition of slavery represents moral change, but not moral improvement.
Some philosophers try to resolve the paradox by arguing that moral knowledge, like scientific knowledge, is discovered gradually through collective human experience and reasoning. Moral truths exist objectively, but they're difficult to discern and often conflict with other human motivations like self-interest and group loyalty. Others propose that moral progress occurs through expanding circles of moral concern. Humans naturally care about themselves, then their families, then their tribes, then their nations. Moral progress involves gradually extending moral consideration to wider and wider groups, other races, genders, species, or even future generations. But this explanation faces the challenge of explaining why such expansion represents genuine progress rather than arbitrary change. Why is caring about more beings necessarily better than caring about fewer? This seems to require some objective standard by which to judge different scopes of moral concern. Evolutionary approaches suggest that moral progress occurs when cultural evolution selects for norms that promote large-scale cooperation and social stability. Societies with more inclusive, fair moral systems might outcompete those with more narrow, harsh systems. But this makes moral progress dependent on practical success rather than moral truth. The paradox reveals tensions in how we think about moral knowledge and moral change. We want to believe that moral progress is real, that we've genuinely learned to be more just and compassionate over time. But explaining such progress requires commitments about the nature of moral truth that are themselves controversial and difficult to defend. Perhaps the resolution lies in understanding moral progress as neither pure discovery of pre-existing truths nor arbitrary cultural change, but as a complex process of moral creativity in which humans develop better ways of living together while facing new challenges and possibilities that previous generations never confronted.
Zeno's paradox of motion. An arrow flies through the air toward its target. At any single instant in time, that arrow occupies a specific position in space. If it occupies that position, then in that instant, it cannot be moving. Since time consists of individual moments, and the arrow isn't moving in any single moment, the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno concluded that motion itself is impossible. This paradox reveals a fundamental puzzle about the nature of motion and time. When we break down any movement into infinitely small moments, we seem to lose the movement itself. Modern physics has grappled with this problem for centuries. Calculus attempts to solve it by dealing with infinitely small changes, but the deeper question remains: what does it really mean for something to move? The arrow paradox forces us to question whether our everyday experience of motion is an illusion, or whether our analytical tools fail to capture something essential about reality. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that it challenges the most basic fact of our existence, that things move through space and time. If Zeno is correct,
then every step you take, every breath you draw, every thought that passes through your mind should be impossible. Yet here we are, undeniably experiencing motion and change. This contradiction between logical analysis and lived experience has puzzled thinkers for over 2 millennia. The paradox suggests that either our senses deceive us about the nature of reality, or our rational methods of understanding the world are fundamentally flawed.
Skepticism. We cannot have genuine knowledge about the external world, the future, or even basic logical and mathematical truths. Philosophical skepticism challenges our most confident beliefs by arguing that adequate evidence or justification for these beliefs is impossible to obtain. Every claim to knowledge faces potentially devastating objections. Ancient skeptics like Pyrrho and Sextus Empiricus developed arguments showing that contradictory opinions exist on virtually every topic, that our senses can deceive us, and that rational arguments can be constructed for opposing positions on most questions. They concluded that the wise course is to suspend judgment rather than claim knowledge about disputed matters. Modern skepticism, exemplified by René Descartes' methodical doubt, uses even more radical arguments. Everything you think you know through your senses could be the product of systematic deception by an evil demon, or dreams that perfectly mimic waking experience. Mathematical truths could be false if your mind systematically malfunctions when performing calculations. The regress argument presents another skeptical challenge. Any justified belief seems to require justification from other beliefs, which require further justification, and so on indefinitely. This creates either an infinite regress of justifications, circular reasoning, or ultimately unjustified foundational beliefs. All three options seem to undermine the possibility of genuine knowledge. Skeptical scenarios like brains in vats or simulated reality use modern technology to update ancient concerns about the reliability of sensory experience. If your experiences could be artificially generated by computers or neuroscience, you cannot know whether your beliefs about the external world correspond to reality. The internally coherent nature of experience provides no guarantee of external validity. However, skepticism faces the challenge of self-refutation. If we cannot have knowledge, then we cannot know that skepticism is true. The skeptic's arguments rely on logical reasoning and empirical observations that their own doctrine calls into question. This creates a performative contradiction between the content of skeptical claims and the act of asserting them.
Some philosophers embrace moderate skepticism while rejecting global skepticism. We might lack certain knowledge while still having probable beliefs or practical knowledge sufficient for daily life. This fallibilist approach acknowledges human cognitive limitations while preserving the possibility of genuine but revisable understanding. Others argue that skeptical scenarios are meaningless or self-defeating. If words get their meaning through their connections to external reality, then a brain in a vat couldn't meaningfully refer to being a brain in a vat. Skeptical hypotheses might be incoherent rather than merely false. Pragmatic responses to skepticism emphasize the practical impossibility of living as though skeptical doubts were serious possibilities. Even convinced skeptics avoid stepping in front of buses and continue making plans based on expectations about the future. This gap between theory and practice might show that skepticism is psychologically unlivable. Contextualist approaches suggest that skeptical arguments succeed only in artificial philosophical contexts where standards for knowledge are unreasonably high. In ordinary contexts, with more reasonable standards, we do have knowledge about many things.
even if we cannot satisfy the skeptic's demands for absolute certainty. The value of skeptical arguments might lie not in their conclusions, but in their role as philosophical tools. Skeptical challenges force us to examine our epistemic practices more carefully and develop better theories of knowledge, justification, and rational belief. Skepticism serves as a permanent reminder of human cognitive limitations and the fallibility of our beliefs. Modern applications of skeptical reasoning appear in science, where systematic doubt and careful testing help distinguish genuine discoveries from wishful thinking or experimental error. Skeptical attitudes toward authority, tradition, and common sense have driven many intellectual advances while creating ongoing tensions with practical needs for belief and action.
The problem of induction. Every morning the sun has risen, every dropped stone has fallen, every heated metal has expanded. Yet we cannot know with certainty that these patterns will continue tomorrow. Philosopher David Hume identified this problem in the 18th century, showing that our most basic reasoning about the future rests on foundations we cannot justify. Inductive reasoning moves from particular observations to general conclusions. We've seen swans that are white, so we conclude all swans are white. We've seen metals expand when heated, so we expect this to continue. But this reasoning assumes that the future will resemble the past, that nature follows consistent patterns, that the laws of physics remain stable. Hume pointed out that we cannot prove any of these assumptions. Our belief that patterns will continue is itself based on the pattern that patterns have continued in the past, creating a circular argument that proves nothing. The problem becomes more troubling when we realize that induction forms the foundation of all scientific knowledge. Every scientific law is based on observing patterns in nature and expecting them to continue. But no amount of past evidence can guarantee future regularity. The universe could change its fundamental laws tomorrow, and we would have no way to predict or prevent it. This doesn't just threaten scientific knowledge, it undermines practical reasoning about everything. When you flip a light switch, you expect the light to turn on based on past experience. When you eat breakfast, you assume it will nourish rather than poison you. When you make plans for tomorrow, you expect the world to continue existing. All these expectations rest on inductive reasoning that Hume showed cannot be logically justified. Some philosophers try to solve the problem by arguing that induction is justified by its success, but this argument itself uses inductive reasoning. Others claim that the uniformity of nature is a necessary assumption for rational thought, but necessary assumptions aren't necessarily true. Still others argue that induction doesn't need justification because it's built into the very concept of rationality. The problem of induction reveals the gap between logical certainty and practical necessity. We cannot prove that inductive reasoning works, yet we cannot live without using it. This suggests that human rationality might be fundamentally different from logical proof, based more on pragmatic success than theoretical justification. Perhaps the mystery isn't why induction sometimes fails, but why it works so often in a universe with no obligation to maintain consistent patterns.
Quietism. Some philosophical problems arise from confusions about language and should be dissolved rather than solved. This metaphilosophical position, associated with Ludwig Wittgenstein's later work, suggests that many traditional philosophical puzzles result from misunderstanding how words actually function in ordinary contexts. Instead of providing theories or arguments to resolve philosophical problems, Quietists recommend careful attention to how language works in practice. When we see how concepts like knowledge, consciousness, or meaning function in their natural settings, apparent paradoxes and mysteries often disappear. The problems were linguistic illusions rather than genuine features of reality. Consider the philosophical problem of other minds. We seem unable to know whether other people have conscious experiences because we cannot directly access their mental states. But quietists might argue that this problem arises from misunderstanding what it means to know about consciousness. In ordinary life, we do recognize when others are in pain, happy, or confused based on their behavior and circumstances. The philosophical puzzle emerges when we demand a special kind of direct access that our concept of mental knowledge never actually required. By returning to ordinary usage, we can see that the problem dissolves. We don't need theoretical solutions, but rather therapeutic clarification of how our concepts actually work. Wittgenstein's private language argument illustrates quietist methodology. Philosophers have puzzled about whether words for mental states, like pain, refer to private internal objects that only the speaker can access. This creates problems about how such words could have public meaning or be learned through interaction with others. Wittgenstein suggests that this picture of language is fundamentally mistaken. Words like pain don't refer to private objects, but function as expressions and communications within shared forms of life. Pain language is learned through training in public contexts where expressions of pain meet with appropriate responses from others.
The philosophical problem about private meaning dissolves when we abandon the misleading picture of words as labels for private objects. There's no theoretical solution needed because there was no genuine problem, only confusion about how language functions in practice. Similarly, questions about the nature of rule following that seem to threaten the possibility of meaningful communication might dissolve when we examine how people actually follow rules in social contexts. Rules aren't abstract objects that determine correct applications, but patterns of activity embedded in shared practices and forms of life. Quietists often criticize traditional philosophy for being overly theoretical and removed from the practical contexts where concepts have their meaning. Philosophical theorizing can create artificial problems by abstracting concepts from the language games and social practices that give them sense. However, Quietism faces objections about whether it can consistently apply to itself. If philosophical problems result from linguistic confusion, what about the philosophical problem of philosophical problems? Quietist arguments seem to require the same kind of theoretical claims they criticize in other philosophical approaches. Some argue that Quietism is too restrictive, abandoning legitimate philosophical inquiry in favor of narrow focus on ordinary language. Important questions about consciousness, knowledge, and morality might require theoretical investigation that goes beyond observing how words are used in everyday contexts. Others suggest that Quietism works better for some philosophical problems than others. Conceptual confusions might indeed be dissolved through attention to ordinary usage, while substantive questions about the nature of reality might require traditional theoretical approaches. The Quietist approach has influenced various philosophical movements, including ordinary language philosophy, therapeutic approaches to philosophical problems, and deflationary theories in areas like truth and meaning. It represents a methodological alternative to systematic philosophical theorizing that emphasizes dissolution over solution.
Moore's paradox. It's raining, but I don't believe it's raining. This sentence seems absurd, yet it's not logically contradictory. The weather conditions and your beliefs about them are separate facts that could, in principle, both be true simultaneously. Yet asserting this sentence appears nonsensical in a way that reveals deep puzzles about belief, knowledge, and assertion. G.E. Moore identified this paradox while exploring the logic of belief attributions. The sentence, "It's raining, but I don't believe it's raining," doesn't contain any logical contradiction. It's possible for it to be raining while you don't believe it is. Similarly, "I believe it's raining, but it's not actually raining," is logically consistent, since beliefs can be false. Yet, both sentences seem impossible to assert sincerely. When you assert that it's raining, you implicitly commit to believing it's raining. Simultaneously denying this belief creates a pragmatic contradiction between what your assertion implies and what you explicitly claim. The problem isn't logical, but concerns the conditions for meaningful assertion. The paradox illuminates the relationship between belief and assertion. Sincere assertion seems to require belief in what you're asserting. You cannot coherently assert something while simultaneously denying that you believe it, even though the content of what you're saying might be logically consistent. This reveals important features of first-person belief attributions. "I believe it's raining" typically adds nothing to "it's raining" in ordinary contexts. Both statements commit you to the same proposition about the weather. The belief attribution becomes redundant when you're the one making the assertion.
However, the paradox becomes more complex when considering different temporal contexts or degrees of certainty. "It was raining yesterday, but I didn't believe it was raining then," seems perfectly acceptable. The paradox applies specifically to present tense, first-person belief attributions that accompany assertions. Some philosophers argue that the paradox shows important differences between belief and knowledge. While more paradoxical sentences about belief are absurd, sentences like, "It's raining, but I don't know it's raining," might be acceptable. This could suggest that assertion requires belief, but not knowledge. Others use the paradox to explore the nature of self-knowledge and the transparency of belief. When properly functioning, our beliefs are typically transparent to us. We know what we believe and can report our beliefs accurately. The paradox might reveal this normal transparency by highlighting cases where it breaks down. The paradox also connects to issues about rational belief and evidence. If you have sufficient evidence to assert that it's raining, you should also believe it's raining. The more paradoxical sentence might be absurd because it implies an irrational relationship between evidence and belief. Psychological interpretations suggest that the paradox reveals cognitive mechanisms that normally keep our beliefs and assertions aligned. When we sincerely assert something, we automatically update our belief states to match our assertions. This explains why more paradoxical sentences feel psychologically impossible rather than merely logically odd. The paradox has implications for understanding testimony, communication, and the epistemology of belief. It suggests that assertion involves commitment to belief in ways that affect how we should interpret and evaluate what people say. The pragmatic dimensions of language might be more fundamental to meaning than purely logical or semantic considerations.
The measurement problem. In the quantum realm,
Reality exists in a ghostly state of possibility until the moment someone decides to look. Quantum mechanics reveals that particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. An electron doesn't have a specific location or momentum. It exists in what physicists call a superposition of all possible states simultaneously. The famous double-slit experiment demonstrates this bizarre reality. A single particle somehow travels through both slits at once, creating an interference pattern that proves it took multiple paths. But here's where the mystery deepens. The moment you try to detect which slit the particle went through, the superposition collapses. The particle chooses one path and behaves like a normal, classical object. The very act of measurement seems to force reality to make up its mind about what's actually happening. This creates what physicists call the measurement problem. What counts as a measurement? Does it require a conscious observer, or is any interaction with the environment sufficient? If a tree falls in a quantum forest with no one around, does it exist in a superposition of fallen and standing states until someone comes along to check? The implications challenge our most basic assumptions about reality. If quantum mechanics is correct, then the world exists in a fuzzy state of potential until observation crystallizes it into actuality. This suggests that consciousness might play a fundamental role in shaping physical reality, or that reality itself is far stranger than we ever imagined. Some interpretations, like the many worlds theory, propose that all possible outcomes actually occur in parallel universes. When you measure a particle, you don't collapse the wave function, you simply find yourself in one branch of an infinitely splitting reality tree. Others argue that the quantum world is fundamentally different from the classical world we experience, with measurement bridging these two realms in ways we don't yet understand. The measurement problem forces us to question the relationship between observation and reality, between mind and matter, between what exists and what we can know exists. It suggests that the act of knowing might be inseparable from the act of creating, making every scientist not just an observer of nature, but a participant in its ongoing creation.
Russell's paradox. Mathematics faced a crisis when Bertrand Russell discovered a simple question that threatened to undermine the entire logical foundation of the discipline. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members. Does this set contain itself or not? If the set contains itself, then it belongs to the category of sets that contain themselves, which means it shouldn't be in the set of all sets that don't contain themselves. But if it doesn't contain itself, then it belongs to the category of sets that don't contain themselves, which means it should be in the set. Either way leads to contradiction. Russell's paradox revealed that the intuitive notion of a set, simply a collection of objects, was not as straightforward as mathematicians had assumed. The paradox showed that unrestricted set formation leads to logical contradictions, forcing mathematicians to develop more careful approaches to the foundations of mathematics. The discovery had profound implications. Set theory was intended to provide a solid foundation for all of mathematics, but Russell's paradox showed that this foundation was shaky. Mathematicians realized they needed new axiomatic systems that would prevent such paradoxes while preserving the mathematical structures they needed. Various solutions emerged, including type theory and axiomatic set theory systems like ZFC, Zermelo-Fraenkel with choice. These systems place restrictions on how sets can be formed, preventing Russell's paradox and similar contradictions. However, they also limit the kinds of mathematical objects that can be constructed.
The paradox illustrates a deeper issue about self-reference and hierarchy. Many paradoxes arise when we allow unlimited self-reference, statements about statements, sets of sets, or categories that categorize themselves. Russell's paradox suggests that reality might have an inherent hierarchical structure that prevents certain forms of self-reference. Beyond mathematics, the paradox raises questions about classification and categorization in general. Any system that allows unrestricted categorization might face similar contradictions. This has implications for logic, computer science, and even everyday reasoning about groups and categories. The problem of free will. In a laboratory decades ago, a scientist made a discovery that could shatter everything you believe about your own agency. The illusion of free will might be the most persistent trick your brain plays on you. When Benjamin Libet hooked volunteers up to brain scanners in the 1980s, he discovered something that shattered our intuitions about choice. He asked people to decide when to move their hand while watching a clock. The shocking result? Brain activity indicating the decision began several hundred milliseconds before people reported being aware they had decided to move. Your brain, it seems, decides before you do. But this raises a disturbing question. If the decision happens before your conscious awareness, who exactly is the you that thinks it's making choices? The implications cascade through every aspect of human experience. That surge of regret after making a mistake, the pride you feel in your accomplishments, the anger towards someone who wronged you. If free will is an illusion, these emotions might be responses to events that were always inevitable, written into the fabric of causality since the universe began. Yet here's the paradox that makes this problem so maddening. Even knowing this, you cannot stop experiencing your choices as genuine. When a judge sentences a criminal, when you feel grateful for a friend's kindness, when you struggle with a difficult decision, the feeling of agency persists. Society itself seems built on the assumption that our choices matter. Some philosophers argue that free will exists in a more subtle form. Your choices, though determined, still emerge from your own complex neural processes, your own memories and values. Others insist this is sophisticated self-deception. The debate rages on, but one thing remains certain. Tomorrow morning, you'll wake up and feel like you're choosing what to have for breakfast, regardless of what the universe decided long ago.
The Cartesian Theater. Consciousness seems to require a place where all sensory information comes together to be experienced by a unified observer. This intuitive model, criticized by philosopher Daniel Dennett, treats the mind like a theater where sensations are presented to an internal audience, a central self that watches the show of experience. The theater metaphor captures how consciousness feels from the inside. Visual information from your eyes, sounds from your ears, and sensations from your body all seem to come together in a unified experiential space where you are aware of them. There appears to be a central location where all this information converges and a central observer who experiences it. However, neuroscience reveals no such central location in the brain. Instead of converging on a single area, sensory processing involves distributed networks that operate in parallel. Visual processing alone involves dozens of specialized areas that handle different aspects like color, motion, and object recognition. There's no master area where all visual information comes together. Dennett argues that the Cartesian theater model is not only empirically false, but conceptually confused. It creates an infinite regress by positing an internal observer who experiences sensations.
but who observes the internal observer? The model requires a homunculus, a little person inside the head, which simply pushes the problem of consciousness back a level without solving it.
This multiple drafts model suggests that there's no precise moment when information becomes conscious and no specific place where consciousness occurs. Instead, different processing systems contribute to ongoing narratives about what's happening, and consciousness emerges from these distributed competitive processes. The model helps explain various puzzling features of consciousness, such as change blindness, the failure to notice large changes in visual scenes, and the phi phenomenon, apparent motion between stationary stimuli. These phenomena suggest that conscious experience is constructed, rather than simply presented to an internal observer. However, critics argue that Dennett's approach fails to capture the essential features of consciousness. Even if there's no literal theater in the brain, there still seems to be something it's like to have conscious experiences. The subjective, qualitative aspects of consciousness, what philosophers call qualia, seem to require explanation even if we abandon the theater metaphor. The debate touches on fundamental questions about the nature of self and personal identity. If consciousness doesn't involve a central agent making decisions, what does it mean to say that someone chose to act in a particular way? The theater model supports intuitive notions of agency, while its rejection might challenge traditional concepts of responsibility. Modern neuroscience continues to investigate questions about neural integration and the binding problem, how the brain combines distributed processing into unified conscious experiences. While there's no literal Cartesian theater, understanding how integration occurs remains an active area of research. The theater metaphor also appears in discussions of artificial consciousness. If consciousness requires integration of information from multiple sources, how might this be implemented in artificial systems? The question of whether computers could have unified conscious experiences depends partly on whether consciousness requires something like a central theater or emerges from distributed processing.
The absurd. A human being seeks meaning and purpose in a universe that offers neither, creating a confrontation that defines the essential condition of human existence. Philosopher Albert Camus identified this confrontation as the source of the absurd. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures who find themselves in a cosmos that appears indifferent to their deepest needs. We desperately want to understand why we exist, what we should do, how we should live, but the universe provides no clear answers to these urgent questions. The absurd isn't just about the absence of pre-given meaning. It's about the mismatch between human nature and the human condition. We're conscious beings, capable of asking profound questions about purpose and value, yet we're also physical objects, subject to the same meaningless laws that govern rocks and gases. We yearn for eternal significance, but face inevitable death. We seek certainty, but find only uncertainty. Traditional responses to this condition often involve what Camus called philosophical suicide, escaping the absurd through religious faith, ideological commitment, or rational systems that claim to provide ultimate answers. But Camus argued that these escapes require abandoning either our need for meaning or our commitment to rational honesty about the world's apparent meaninglessness.
Instead, Camus proposed embracing the absurd fully, accepting both our need for meaning and the world's silence about meaning. This doesn't lead to despair, but to a kind of defiant freedom. If the universe doesn't provide ready-made purposes, then we're free to create our own. If there's no ultimate meaning, then we can find meaning in the very act of living fully despite meaninglessness. The absurd hero, exemplified by Sisyphus eternally pushing his boulder up the mountain, finds dignity not in achieving ultimate goals, but in the struggle itself. Camus famously concluded that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding fulfillment in the very activity that seems meaningless from an external perspective. This creates what might be called the paradox of the absurd. The recognition that life is meaningless can itself become a source of meaning and liberation. By accepting the absurd condition fully, we achieve a kind of authentic existence that's not possible for those who either deny meaninglessness or despair because of it. The absurd reveals something essential about human consciousness. We're perhaps the only beings capable of recognizing our own cosmic insignificance, and this recognition might be the very thing that gives us significance. In a meaningless universe, the ability to confront meaninglessness courageously might be the closest thing to ultimate meaning we can achieve.
Hyperobjects. Some entities are so massive in spatial and temporal dimensions that they exceed normal human comprehension and interaction. Philosopher Timothy Morton's concept of hyperobjects describes phenomena like climate change, nuclear materials, and mass extinction that exist on scales far beyond ordinary experience, yet profoundly affect human life. These objects are viscous. They stick to whatever comes into contact with them. You cannot simply walk away from climate change or nuclear radiation. They affect every aspect of life on Earth, from weather patterns to genetic mutations, making clean separation from them impossible. Once you encounter a hyperobject, you become part of its field of influence. Hyperobjects are also non-local. They cannot be located at any specific place and time, even though they have local manifestations. Climate change appears in particular weather events, rising sea levels, and changing ecosystems, but it's not identical to any collection of these local phenomena. The hyperobject exceeds its manifestations while being real and causally effective. They exhibit temporal undulation. They create their own temporalities that don't conform to human timescales. Nuclear waste remains dangerous for tens of thousands of years, far beyond the duration of any human institution or cultural memory. Climate change operates on geological timescales while producing effects in human time. These temporal complexities make hyperobjects difficult to understand and address through normal planning and policy mechanisms. Hyperobjects are phased. They occupy a higher dimensional space than the objects we normally encounter. Just as a three-dimensional sphere appears to two-dimensional beings as a series of changing circles, hyperobjects appear to humans as a series of seemingly unconnected local phenomena. We encounter only cross-sections of these massive entities.
Finally, hyperobjects are interobjective. They exist in the spaces between other objects, rather than being substances with clear boundaries. Climate change exists in the relationships between atmospheric gases, ocean currents, biological systems, and human activities. It's not a thing, but a pattern of relationships that spans multiple systems and scales. The concept challenges traditional ways of thinking about objects, causation, and agency. Hyperobjects are neither fully natural nor fully cultural. They emerge from the interaction of human activities with large-scale natural processes. They represent a new kind of entity that transcends the nature-culture divide. Understanding hyperobjects requires what Morton calls dark ecology, recognizing that humans are already entangled with these massive entities, whether they acknowledge it or not. Traditional environmentalism often assumes a separation between humans and nature that hyperobjects make impossible to maintain. The concept also has political implications. Hyperobjects create forms of collective action problems that exceed the capacity of existing political institutions. Nation-states cannot address climate change individually, but international cooperation remains difficult. Democratic processes operate on timescales much shorter than those relevant to hyperobjects. Psychologically, hyperobjects can produce anxiety, depression, and a sense of helplessness. They're too large to comprehend fully, too persistent to escape, and too complex to control. This creates new forms of ecological trauma and existential anxiety that previous generations didn't face. However, recognizing hyperobjects might also enable more effective responses. Instead of assuming that environmental problems can be solved through individual consumer choices or simple policy changes, the hyperobject concept suggests the need for systemic changes that acknowledge the massive scales and complex temporalities involved. The concept connects to broader philosophical questions about scale, temporality, and human agency in the Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch defined by human impact on Earth systems. Hyperobjects represent a new category of entities that emerge when human activities reach planetary scales. Morton's analysis draws on object-oriented ontology, which attempts to develop philosophical frameworks adequate to complex, networked, and multi-scalar realities. Hyperobjects illustrate the inadequacy of traditional philosophical categories for understanding the kinds of entities that characterize contemporary environmental crises.
Panpsychism. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present at every level of physical existence. This radical view suggests that even elementary particles, atoms, and molecules possess some form of primitive experience or awareness. Complex consciousness emerges from the combination and organization of these basic mental properties. The doctrine challenges conventional assumptions about the distribution of consciousness in nature. Instead of viewing awareness as a rare property that emerges only in complex biological systems, panpsychism treats consciousness as ubiquitous, a basic feature of matter itself, like mass or electric charge. Contemporary interest in panpsychism has grown partly from problems with explaining how consciousness could emerge from purely physical processes. If mental properties are fundamentally different from physical properties, it's mysterious how they could arise from purely physical arrangements of matter and energy. Panpsychism avoids this emergence problem by making consciousness fundamental rather than emergent. The view doesn't claim that electrons or atoms have human-like experiences with complex thoughts and emotions. Rather, they might possess extremely simple forms of experience, perhaps just basic responsiveness to their environment, or primitive forms of what it's like to be in particular physical states. Human consciousness would emerge from the integration of countless such micro-experiences. Philip Goff and other contemporary panpsychists argue that this approach provides the most promising solution to the hard problem of consciousness, explaining why there's something it's like to have subjective experiences. Physical science describes the structure and dynamics of neural processes, but seems to leave out the qualitative, subjective aspects of consciousness. However,
Panpsychism faces the combination problem, explaining how micro-experiences combine into unified macro-experiences like human consciousness. If each neuron in your brain has its own primitive experience, what creates the unified stream of consciousness that seems to characterize human mental life? Why don't you experience billions of separate micro-consciousnesses instead of integrated awareness? The view also raises questions about the boundaries and varieties of consciousness. If elementary particles are conscious, what about complex systems like thermostats, computers, or ecosystems? Panpsychism might imply that consciousness is far more widespread than we typically assume, extending to systems we don't normally consider sentient. Some versions of panpsychism, called cosmopsychism, suggest that the universe as a whole is conscious, with individual minds as aspects or components of cosmic consciousness. This approach might solve the combination problem by starting with unified cosmic consciousness and explaining individual minds as derivative rather than fundamental. Critics argue that panpsychism is unparsimonious, postulating consciousness where there's no evidence for it and no explanatory need. If we can explain all observable behavior in terms of physical processes, why assume that these processes are accompanied by undetectable conscious experiences? The view might violate principles of scientific economy. Others question whether the concept of microconsciousness is coherent. Consciousness as we know it involves complex integration of information, temporal awareness, and rich qualitative experiences. It's unclear whether these features can be meaningfully attributed to simple physical systems, or whether talk of electron consciousness is more metaphorical than literal. Panpsychism also faces challenges about mental causation. If consciousness is fundamental, how does it interact with physical processes? The view might face similar problems to substance dualism about explaining how mental properties influence physical behavior without violating physical laws. Despite these challenges, panpsychism offers a distinctive approach to consciousness that takes seriously both the reality of subjective experience and the continuity of nature. It suggests that consciousness might be a basic feature of reality, rather than a strange accident that appears only in complex biological systems. The view connects to broader questions about the nature of matter, the scope of science, and humanity's place in the natural world. If consciousness is fundamental, rather than rare, it might change how we understand our relationship to the rest of nature and our responsibilities toward other potentially conscious systems.
The Naturalistic Fallacy. You cannot derive an ought from an is. This principle, identified by philosopher G.E. Moore, argues that moral conclusions cannot be validly derived from purely factual premises. Descriptive statements about how the world is cannot logically establish prescriptive claims about how it ought to be. The fallacy appears in arguments that move from natural facts to moral conclusions without adequate justification. For example, someone might argue that competition is morally good because it exists throughout nature, or that certain behaviors are wrong because they are natural. These arguments seem to commit a logical error by inferring values from facts. Moore's specific concern was with attempts to define moral terms like good in terms of natural properties like pleasure, evolutionary fitness, or social approval. He argued that such definitions always leave open the question of whether things with those natural properties are actually good. This open question argument suggests that moral properties cannot be reduced to natural ones. The naturalistic fallacy has been influential in metaethics and moral philosophy, supporting the view that ethics is autonomous from science and descriptive inquiry. If moral conclusions cannot be derived from factual premises, then ethical theory requires its own methods and principles that go beyond empirical investigation. However, the fallacy faces several challenges and complications. Many moral arguments do seem to rely on factual premises in legitimate ways. If causing unnecessary suffering is wrong, and if a particular action causes unnecessary suffering, then that action seems to be wrong. The moral conclusion follows validly from a combination of factual and normative premises. The key insight might be that moral arguments require at least one normative premise, some claim about values, duties, or rights. Purely factual premises cannot generate moral conclusions, but combinations of facts and values can support normative arguments. The fallacy warns against missing normative premises rather than prohibiting all connections between facts and values.
Some philosophers argue that the strict fact-value distinction underlying the naturalistic fallacy is untenable. Descriptions and evaluations might be more intertwined than Moore assumed. Scientific descriptions often involve value-laden concepts, while moral evaluations depend heavily on factual beliefs about consequences and circumstances. Evolutionary approaches to ethics challenge the naturalistic fallacy by arguing that moral judgments track natural facts about what promotes human flourishing or social cooperation. If moral properties are natural properties, then the fallacy might rest on false assumptions about the relationship between nature and value. Pragmatic approaches suggest that the naturalistic fallacy is better understood as a warning about argumentative practice rather than a logical principle. Arguments that move too quickly from descriptive to normative claims often overlook important moral considerations or alternative value frameworks. The fallacy reminds us to be explicit about our normative commitments. The environmental movement has struggled with implications of the naturalistic fallacy. Appeals to preserve natural ecosystems or live in harmony with nature seem to derive moral conclusions from facts about naturalness. Critics argue that such arguments commit the naturalistic fallacy by assuming that natural states are automatically morally preferable. However, environmental philosophers respond that the fallacy doesn't prohibit all connections between natural facts and moral values. Scientific information about ecological relationships, environmental health, and sustainability can inform moral arguments when combined with appropriate normative premises about well-being, future generations, or intrinsic value. The debate also affects medical ethics, where arguments about human nature, biological functions, and evolutionary history intersect with questions about treatment, enhancement, and the goals of medicine. The naturalistic fallacy challenges simplistic appeals to what's natural, while allowing for more sophisticated connections between biological facts and medical values. Contemporary discussions focus on whether there are natural facts that have inherent normative significance, rather than requiring additional evaluative premises. Some argue that facts about human needs, capabilities, or flourishing have built-in moral relevance that doesn't depend on external value judgments.
The extended mind hypothesis. The boundaries of your mind extend beyond your skull to include tools, technologies, and environmental resources that support cognitive processes. This provocative thesis, developed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, challenges traditional assumptions about where minds end and the external world begins. Consider how you use a smartphone to remember phone numbers, navigate unfamiliar places, and access information. The phone functions as an extension of your memory and cognitive abilities, rather than merely a tool you use.
When the information stored in your phone is as readily accessible as information stored in your biological memory, the phone becomes part of your extended cognitive system. The hypothesis argues that cognitive processes can extend beyond the boundaries of individual brains when certain conditions are met. External resources must be reliably available, automatically endorsed without critical reflection, easily accessible, and integrated into ongoing cognitive processes in the same way that internal mental states are integrated. A person with Alzheimer's disease who relies on a notebook to remember daily activities might have a genuinely extended memory system. If the notebook is constantly available, automatically trusted, and accessed as readily as biological memory, it functions as part of the person's cognitive apparatus rather than merely an external aid. Similarly, skilled mathematicians who manipulate equations on paper aren't simply using tools to help them think. The paper becomes part of the thinking process itself. The cognitive work happens in the interaction between mind and external representations rather than solely inside the mathematician's head. The hypothesis has implications for understanding cognitive enhancement, educational technology, and the effects of digital devices on human mental capacities. If minds can extend into technologies, then improving those technologies might constitute genuine cognitive improvement rather than merely providing better tools.
However, the extended mind thesis faces several objections. Critics argue that there are important differences between internal cognitive processes and external tools. Internal memories are available even when you're isolated from external resources, while extended memory systems can be lost, damaged, or unavailable when needed. The reliability and portability of biological cognition might be essential features that external resources cannot fully replicate. Your smartphone might function like an extension of memory in some contexts, but it differs from biological memory in ways that matter for understanding the nature of mind. Others question whether the extended mind thesis is more than a useful metaphor. Even if external resources are tightly integrated with cognitive processes, they might remain tools rather than literal parts of the mind. The thesis might describe intimate tool use rather than genuine mental extension. The boundary problem also poses challenges. If minds can extend to include smartphones, what prevents them from extending to include the entire internet, other people, or environmental resources? The extended mind thesis might lead to unacceptably broad conclusions about the scope of individual minds. Defenders argue that the thesis doesn't eliminate boundaries, but locates them differently, based on functional rather than spatial criteria. What matters is not where cognitive processes occur physically, but how different resources are integrated into ongoing mental activity. The hypothesis connects to broader questions about individualism in psychology and philosophy. If minds can be extended and distributed across multiple resources, traditional assumptions about individual cognition and personal identity might need revision. The self might be less bounded and more networked than typically assumed. Educational implications include reconsidering what students need to learn when external cognitive resources are readily available. If information can be accessed instantly, educational priorities might shift toward developing skills for finding, evaluating, and integrating information rather than memorizing facts. The extended mind thesis also raises questions about digital divides and cognitive justice. If access to cognitive technologies affects mental capacities, then inequalities in technological access constitute inequalities in cognitive opportunities. This has implications for educational policy and social justice.
The problem of persistence. You were once a single cell, then a baby, a child, a teenager, and now an adult. But what makes all these different beings the same person, persisting through time? This problem challenges our most basic assumptions about identity and existence. Every physical part of your body has been replaced multiple times since birth. Your thoughts, beliefs, personality, and memories have all changed dramatically. In what sense are you the same person who existed 20 years ago? The puzzle becomes acute when we consider borderline cases. Imagine someone with severe dementia who has lost all memories of their previous life and whose personality has completely changed. Are they still the same person, or has the original person ceased to exist while their body continues living? Traditional answers seem inadequate. Physical continuity fails because your body constantly changes. Psychological continuity fails because memories fade, personalities evolve, and beliefs transform. Some philosophers propose that personal identity consists in the continuity of consciousness, but consciousness is frequently interrupted by sleep, anesthesia, and unconscious states. The problem extends beyond personal identity to the persistence of all objects through time. Consider a river. The water is constantly flowing and changing, yet we speak of the same river existing for centuries. Or a ship that has every part gradually replaced. At what point, if any, does it become a different ship? Some philosophers embrace the radical conclusion that nothing really persists through time. They argue that what we call persistent objects are actually sequences of momentary stages connected by various relations. On this view, you don't exist through time, but are rather a series of person stages that share certain connections. Others maintain that persistence is real, but conventional rather than metaphysical. We decide based on our practical interests which temporal stages count as stages of the same continuing object. Personal identity becomes a useful fiction that helps us navigate social relationships and moral responsibilities, but there's no objective fact about whether you're really the same person you were years ago. The problem has profound implications for moral responsibility, survival, and the meaning of death. If personal identity is conventional, can you be held responsible for actions performed by earlier person stages? If you don't really persist through time, what exactly do you hope to preserve when you try to avoid dying? Recent developments in neuroscience and technology make these questions increasingly practical. If consciousness could be uploaded to a computer, would the digital copy be you continuing to exist, or someone else with your memories? If your brain were gradually replaced with functionally equivalent artificial parts, would you survive the transformation? The problem of persistence might reveal that our concepts of identity and survival are more fragile than we typically assume. Perhaps the notion of enduring through time is a cognitive illusion that serves important psychological and social functions but doesn't correspond to any deep metaphysical truth. Or perhaps persistence is real but more mysterious than our everyday thinking suggests, involving forms of continuity that science and philosophy are only beginning to understand. The simulation argument. At least one of the following propositions must be true. Civilizations rarely reach technological maturity. Technologically mature civilizations rarely run ancestor simulations. Or you are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. This trilemma, proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom, uses probabilistic reasoning to argue that simulated beings might vastly outnumber non-simulated ones. The argument begins with the assumption that if civilizations develop sufficient computational power, they might run detailed simulations of their ancestors or other historical periods. These simulations would be populated by conscious beings who experience their simulated world as completely real.
If such simulations are possible, and civilizations create many of them, then simulated beings would vastly outnumber non-simulated beings. The original biological humans who created the first simulations would be hugely outnumbered by their simulated descendants. From a probabilistic perspective, any randomly selected conscious being would be much more likely to be simulated than original. The argument doesn't claim that we are definitely living in a simulation, only that we cannot confidently conclude we are not. If technological civilizations commonly run ancestor simulations, then most conscious beings with experiences like ours would be simulated. We have no reliable way to distinguish simulated experience from original experience. However, the argument depends on controversial assumptions about consciousness, computation, and the motivations of future civilizations. It requires that simulated beings can be genuinely conscious rather than merely exhibiting the behavioral signs of consciousness. If simulations cannot produce real conscious experience, then the argument fails.
The assumption that future civilizations would be interested in running ancestor simulations is also questionable. They might prefer to devote computational resources to other projects, or ethical concerns might prevent them from creating conscious beings solely for simulation purposes. Some responses attempt to show that simulation scenarios are self-undermining. If you believe you're probably simulated, you might also believe that the evidence supporting the simulation argument is itself simulated and therefore unreliable. This could create a defeater for the very reasoning that led to simulation beliefs. Others argue that simulation scenarios face the same problems as traditional skeptical scenarios about external world knowledge. Even if simulated experience is possible, this doesn't undermine knowledge claims or rational belief formation. The practical irrelevance of simulation scenarios might make them philosophically uninteresting. The argument has connections to questions about personal identity and survival. If you discovered you were simulated, would this threaten your continued existence? If the simulation ended, would you die? Or would your death be different from biological death? These questions probe intuitions about the relationship between consciousness and its physical substrate. Contemporary interest in the simulation argument has been driven partly by rapid advances in virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and computational power. These developments make detailed simulations seem more plausible, while raising questions about the long-term trajectory of technological development. The argument also appears in discussions of existential risk and the future of humanity. If advanced civilizations typically destroy themselves before developing simulation capabilities, this might explain why we don't observe evidence of widespread simulations. Alternatively, if we are simulated, this might provide evidence that technological civilizations can survive to create such simulations. Some researchers have proposed empirical tests that might detect signatures of simulated reality, though these remain highly speculative. The fundamental challenge is that a sufficiently sophisticated simulation might be indistinguishable from reality to its inhabitants. Solipsism. Only your own mind can be known to exist with certainty. Everything else, other people, the external world, even your own body, might be illusion. This radical philosophical position holds that you are the only conscious being in existence, and all apparent reality is merely the content of your own consciousness. Solipsism emerges from taking skeptical arguments to their logical extreme. You have direct access only to your own mental states, your thoughts, sensations, and experiences.
You cannot directly observe anyone else's consciousness or verify that the external world exists independently of your perception. If certainty requires direct knowledge, then only your own mind passes the test. The position seems absurd to most people, yet it proves remarkably difficult to refute through pure logic. Every argument against solipsism relies on premises that the solipsist can question. Appeals to other people's testimony assume those people exist. Scientific evidence presupposes an external world that produces reliable data. Even the argument that solipsism is unlikely assumes probability calculations that might themselves be mental constructions. Yet solipsism faces serious practical and theoretical problems. If other people don't exist, why does their behavior seem so complex and unpredictable? Why can't you control your experiences at will if they're products of your own mind? The richness and independence of apparent external reality suggests sources beyond a single consciousness. Some philosophers argue that solipsism is meaningless rather than false. If you're the only conscious being, then concepts like other minds and external world can't refer to anything real. The solipsist's language would lack the meanings necessary to express their own position. This linguistic argument suggests solipsism defeats itself through problems of reference and communication.
Others point out that solipsism is unlivable. Even committed solipsists behave as if other people exist. They avoid traffic, engage in conversations, and respond emotionally to apparent others' welfare. This gap between theory and practice might show that solipsism conflicts with basic human psychology. The problem of other minds represents a milder version of solipsistic concerns. Even if you accept that other people have physical bodies and brains, you cannot directly observe their conscious experiences. How do you know that others feel pain, see colors, or have any inner life at all? They might be unconscious automatons that behave exactly like conscious beings. Modern neuroscience and psychology provide increasingly detailed accounts of how consciousness relates to brain activity. These findings suggest that similar brain states should produce similar conscious experiences across different individuals. If consciousness emerges from neural processes, then people with similar brains should have similar mental lives. However, these scientific arguments still require inferential leaps that determined skeptics can reject. The correlation between brain states and reported conscious experiences doesn't prove that consciousness exists beyond your own case. Other apparent people might be unconscious systems that happen to produce brain patterns and behaviors similar to those associated with consciousness in your own case. Solipsism ultimately raises questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and rational belief. While few people seriously entertain solipsistic doubts, the position highlights how much of our understanding relies on assumptions that cannot be proven with absolute certainty. Phenomenology. Philosophy should study consciousness as it's directly experienced rather than as it's explained by science or common sense. This approach, developed by Edmund Husserl and later thinkers like Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, focuses on the structures and contents of conscious experience itself. Phenomenology begins with the phenomenological reduction, bracketing questions about whether our experiences correspond to external reality and focusing instead on how things appear to consciousness. Instead of asking whether the red apple I see actually exists, phenomenology examines the experience of red apple appearing and its essential structures. This method reveals features of consciousness that other approaches overlook. Experience has intentionality. It's always directed toward objects or states of affairs. When you perceive, remember, or imagine, you're always perceiving something, remembering something, or imagining something. Consciousness is essentially relational, involving both experiencing acts and experienced objects. Phenomenology also discovers the temporal structure of consciousness. Experience isn't composed of isolated moments, but involves retention of the just past, attention to the present, and protension toward the about to come. This temporal flow is essential to conscious experience, rather than being constructed from separate temporal atoms. The lived body plays a central role in phenomenological analysis. Unlike the objective body studied by science, the lived body is the subjective body as experienced from within. It's the center of perception, the organ of action, and the basis for spatial and temporal orientation. We don't simply have bodies, we are embodied beings whose consciousness is essentially corporeal.
Heidegger's existential phenomenology focuses on the structure of human existence, or Dasein, being in the world. He argues that traditional philosophy has overlooked the fundamental fact that we're always already engaged with the world in practical contexts, rather than standing back as detached observers. Our primary mode of being involves skillful coping with equipment and situations, rather than theoretical contemplation. This analysis reveals that knowledge and perception are grounded in more basic forms of engagement with the world. Before we theoretically understand hammers as tools with certain properties, we encounter them as equipment ready to hand for particular projects. The theoretical attitude represents a breakdown of this more primordial engaged mode of being. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception emphasizes the role of the body in shaping conscious experience. Perception isn't simply receiving sensory data, but actively exploring the world through bodily movement and manipulation. The body is both the subject that perceives and part of the world that can be perceived. His analysis of phenomena like phantom limbs, acquired motor skills, and depth perception shows that conscious experience involves a complex interplay between the body, the environment, and learned patterns of behavior. Consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of the biological organism to include the tools and environments that become incorporated into skilled action. However, phenomenology faces criticism for its subjective methodology and apparent disconnection from empirical science. Critics argue that first-person analysis cannot provide reliable knowledge about the structure of consciousness because it lacks the objectivity and reproducibility that characterize scientific inquiry. Defenders respond that phenomenology provides essential insights that complement rather than compete with scientific approaches. Neuroscience might explain the mechanisms underlying consciousness, but it cannot tell us what consciousness is like from the inside. Phenomenology examines the phenomena that science attempts to explain. Contemporary developments include neurophenomenology, which combines phenomenological analysis with neuroscientific research, and experimental phenomenology, which uses controlled experiments to investigate the structures revealed by phenomenological reflection. These approaches seek to bridge the gap between first-person and third-person approaches to consciousness. Phenomenology has also influenced psychology, psychiatry, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence. Its insights about embodiment, intentionality, and temporal consciousness have shaped research on topics ranging from mental illness to robot design. The phenomenological tradition continues to provide resources for understanding consciousness and human existence.